Welcome to episode 2 of GMOs Revealed. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Gentempo, and today we have a heck of an experience set up for you. We're starting off with part 2 of my interview with Dr. Zach Bush. Part 1 we got incredible feedback on, and if you like that, wait till you see part 2. We are also interviewing Jeffrey Smith, and Jeffrey Smith is one of the most recognized figures in the world on the anti-GMO movement. He is very articulate, very compelling, and somebody that the time is going to go by so quickly when you watch that you're going to wonder where it went. We also have Dr. Dan Pompa. And one of the things that's very important to me is to bring to you solutions. I mean, there's a lot of challenge with this GMO issue, but if we just leave it at the challenges, it's not a good thing. We also have to have solutions. What actions can you take? And Dr. Pompa is an expert on that. So watch that so you get the information that you need. I hope you've been sharing this with your friends and loved ones. They need to know this information. Remember, we're streaming globally free right now, and we want everybody in the world to get this information because there's nowhere else. There's oppressive forces that are preventing people from getting the information they need to protect themselves and to live a healthier and better life. So enjoy episode 2, and I'll see you after it's over. So now on the timeline, we're in the 90s. They are desiccating the wheat, with the Roundup product. When did GMOs get introduced, and what was the theory or the thinking behind that?
I think the thinking, I'm sure, had to do with the wheat experience. Is when they realized that they could have entire crops sprayed with it, that suddenly it was like 100 to 1,000-fold more volume intake by a single farmer. And so I'm sure it didn't take long for their business folks to say, we need to spray every crop for this stuff. And so how is that possible? And so they went to their scientists and say, how can we spray this on corn, soybean, all of our staple crops, not just wheat?
And not kill them.
And not kill them. And so that's where GMO became necessary, because the chemical will kill soybeans or any plant you spray it on there. And so they had to come up with a genetic modification so that the targets for glyphosate would be perturbed. And they did this through an amino acid switch. And so some of the proteins that are in that enzyme chain that I mentioned, the shikimate enzyme pathway, that pathway has very specific targets, and there's protein receptors. And so when we say GMO, what's happening is they're genetically modifying the targets that would have been affected by that. So now they can have corn or soybean, or now bizarrely salmon and other things that have different receptors, and they just change that one amino acid in there, and it's enough to change the structure of that so that it's not affected directly by the glyphosate.
So basically what they're saying is they can genetically modify the plant, or like you're saying, even at salmon, they're really spreading their application of this particular technology. But so saying, okay, normally the plant would be killed by this toxic substance. We're going to make it sort of resistant to it by changing the things genetically that would normally respond to poison. But logically, I'd have to say, if something is being poisoned and it loses its ability to know that it's being poisoned, in essence, aren't there other unintended consequences to doing that to a plant?
Absolutely. And the very nature, we mentioned that the nature of this chemical is to rob the soil and the plant and the bacteria of the ability to make these essential amino acids. Well, those amino acids aren't just important for human biology. The reason why the plant suddenly dies after you spray it with Roundup, your weed or whatever it is because it suddenly can't make the basic building blocks for the plant.
Right.
And so it dries up in 3 days and dies, shrivels away. And so when you now genetically modify the crop to be able to survive that, now you're growing a crop that is with every application of Roundup, which happens repeatedly throughout the life cycle of that crop, right? And so you might spray all the weeds dead with Roundup at the beginning, and then you plant all your corn, and then 6 to 8 weeks in, the weeds are coming up, so you spray again, and 6 weeks in, you spray again. And so you're constantly re-exposing the soil and the plant to this thing, which is blocking its ability to make nutrients, which of course has a huge effect on the consumer, right? And so the consumer is now eating food that is lacking these essential building blocks, but it has huge implications for the immune system of the plant. I mentioned briefly there the gluten sensitivity phenomenon. what's happening when that synergy happens from gliadin, the gluten product, and glyphosate from the Roundup, when those two come together, it creates leak in the membrane of your intestines. And so you can no longer have an intelligent barrier or membrane to absorb nutrients and keep the toxins out. Same thing is happening at the plant rootlet. Plant rootlets look like the villi of your intestine. Intestine looks like coral reef under a microscope. It's beautiful, complicated, big projections of villi that are reaching out for nutrients, and it looks very much coral reef-like. Well, if you look at a root fiber, the microscopic root fibers on the ends of the roots that you can see when you pull it, it looks the same, villi, these big projections and everything else. Well, those are going to also start to leak as you damage the cellular connections between the cells and the big membranes of the root system. And so by the constant application of this chemical, it might look like a green crop growing with no weeds in it, but in fact, those crops are suffering at the very basic foundation of the separation between soil and their immune system is starting to break down and they're leaking. This means they're going to be more prone to fungi, to insects and everything else because the plant immune system is failing.
So this timeline is fascinating. We start pre-World War II, kind of look at the evolution of farming, looking at these chemical companies which are a part of the military-industrial complex. Suddenly now that gets pointed into our farming practices, and we see emergent over time, Super Bowl commercials and
yes.
For Roundup, and how this is all eventuated into the actual introduction in the mid-90s to GMOs, where they're now starting to genetically modify the plants. And this is the thing that I find fascinating is that it was an idea born out of how to use more of our chemicals on crops.
Yes.
Not born out of saying, hey, we have an innovation in farming, but the impetus, it's backwards, and that's why I think a lot of people understand. It wasn't, wow, this is some great discovery that came out, and now let's make a pesticide, that can work in conjunction with GMOs. It's like, hey, we got this stuff. It kills stuff, and if they could spray a little bit on the stuff you want to kill, but if we could spray it on the entire crop, we're going to 10x, 100x, 1,000x the sale of this. It's really a fascinating story. It reads like a novel. So now we're in the mid-90s, and we have this thing going on where, okay, now they've actually got these GMOs, and we found out that we could spray these crops with it. So how does it go now from the 90s? What's the progression into where we are now today?
It's, this insidious creep, right, of consumer behavior and everything else. The concept of a genetically modified food was a flashpoint. I mean, it was so charged scientifically as much as, in the consumer's mind, perhaps. But it only took a couple of years of reassurance, look, we're using this all over the country, there's no health effects that have been measured, it doesn't have human targets, for us to get lulled into a sense of safety or lulled into a belief that somebody knows that this is safe, when in fact it's never been known that it's safe.
Was there ever any real scientific testing done? I mean, the EPA is kind of the equivalent for agriculture as the FDA is for medicine, right? So if you're going to get a drug put on the market, they require some pretty severe controlled testing and documentation. Did that happen with GMOs?
Not at all. I mean, you don't have a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of anything in agriculture, right? And so you should, and then you should not only just do it for the plants, you should do it for the consumer, i.e. the animal that's going to consume that crop or the human. And yet we have this complete breakdown of effort from the EPA, and they always claim, not enough budget, which frankly is true. They're not given enough budget to really evaluate this, so they are depending all the time on these manufacturers, on the companies themselves, to produce their own data of safety and efficacy for the food chain. And so when we put a drug into the food environment, so for example, if you do a drug for cattle to increase their feed efficiency or something like that, you're required to do a blinded study to show safety, randomized study, all of the kind of typical things. But if you do a chemical into a crop, you're not asked to do that. Nobody's asked to do Roundup versus BT versus some other chemical to show the biologic nutrient quality of that food, all of this. And so safety is easily proved under a microscope. Pick a few cells that aren't directly damaged by the glyphosate and see there's no damage to the cells. Well, what we're showing is that it's not actually the damage to the cells, it's damage to the extracellular matrix. Well, there is no safety protocols for looking at the extracellular matrix. In humans, even in FDA trials, we don't even do drug trials looking at extracellular matrix toxicity.
What is the extracellular matrix?
Imagine a house without the frame, you know. Now you got floppy drywall and some shingles up there.
Right.
You got nothing. And that's what a human cell structure, 70 trillion cells are useless without the framework. But extracellular matrix is the framework, but it goes further than just scaffolding or strength or skeletal structure. It actually is the communication network. The extracellular matrix under an electron scanning microscope looks like fiber optic cables. And they literally function this way. These gap junctions connect the cytoplasm, or this highly protected inside of the cellular environment in one cell, to that of another cell. So the intracellular environment of the cell, once there's an intact extracellular matrix, is body-wide. My liver cell is connected to every other cell in the body through this extracellular matrix. You start to crush that, and you start to isolate cells. You start to get loneliness at the cellular level, which has all kinds of interesting phenomena. But to answer your question directly, not only did we not do the studies that were being submitted by the drug companies or the chemical companies weren't the right ones.
They were narrow in their scope.
They were narrow in their scope. They cherry-picked the data, right? Oh, we have these cells, we can show has no toxicity. So they cherry-pick their data and say, see, it doesn't affect human biology.
Right. So now this is all in the marketplace. It's put into farming practice. Monsanto literally has a patent on these seeds, right? And now if you've got a farm that's using GMO crops and adjacent to it is a farm that doesn't, we can't contain the influence of these GMO crops, right? I mean, when they go to seed, et cetera, can it spread around? And how do you contain this? The genie's out of the bottle.
I don't think anybody saw this coming.
Yeah.
The socio-political implications of having a patent on a seed is creepy. You can't patent a naturally occurring compound. You just can't do that. And so for all of human history, seeds were not patentable. Seeds were owned by the farmer. And so we did our own seed harvesting. There was these wonderful guys who had their whole business was just reclaiming seed for the farmer. And so they would take a portion of the corn crop or a portion of the soybean or a portion of the wheat crop, and they would put it through seed cleaner machines and then return to the farmer bags and bags of seeds for their next year. And so 10% of their crop or so would be preserved as seed crop. And so they didn't sell 10% of their crop, they just turned that into their own seeds and would plant that the following year. That's all of human history.
Right.
And then suddenly, the possibility of patenting a seed means that you can now own that seed, i.e. the farmer doesn't own that intellectual property. And that was the trick that they used to really amp up their business plan. It's one thing to have a GMO corn, but how do you get farmers all the way across the country to pay a premium, pay more, for a genetically modified seed? Well, first you have to bake up some sort of marketing plan. So you create a story of like, well, this is here to create crop yield, increase the yield per acre. But I think your point earlier was critical, is the reason these things went into practice had nothing to do with crop yield. They were envisioned as a potential marketplace for chemical sales. That's why this whole story was created. And so at no point did Monsanto set out to say, we want to create higher crop yield. They wanted to sell more Roundup. And so then they created this whole study. They said, well, let's do a short-term study to show higher crop yield per acre. Well, if you do that for 1 or 2 or 3 years, you can get a higher crop yield momentarily because you're stressing the crop. This is the interesting thing about any biology. We do this with our cattle. They grow fatter faster if we stress them, so we can take them to butcher quicker.
So you're asserting then that it's not a foregone conclusion that GMOs increase crop yield. You're saying that's it goes through a honeymoon period, if you will, for a period of time where you see this increase in yield, but it's not a sustainable thing.
This has already been published. And so 7 years, 10 years into that crop, if you keep growing GMO on the same plot of land, 7 to 10 years in, suddenly you're seeing a drop in yield.
Wow. So that is, and you're saying this is published already. So this is known, and it's
Yes.
gone through peer review, et cetera. So this is something that, really is deflating to this whole concept out there that GMOs are the savior of the world, that the horrors of starvation are going to be averted, et cetera. And don't worry about all those conspiracy theorists who are saying, oh, they're proven completely safe, and all these people who are waving their arms around, leaky gut and all these other, maladies that are emerging in humanity post the GMO and Roundup era, that stuff is all just, these are crazy people talking. So now, and this is, so we're looking now, so we've seen decades now since it's introduced, the farming practices. We're now seeing studies that are coming in saying that the yield is not sustainable. There's a period of increased yield, then it drops off. And now you're saying that the parent company of Monsanto, while we're watching all this happen, is looking to sell it off to Bayer. So what do you know about that?
Well, I think even before we get to that point, there's definitely many sociopolitical, geopolitical reasons for that sale, I think, to be going on. Mm-hmm. But I think that the more striking thing for looking at those late 90s, early 2000s is, so they were trying to make an argument to the farmer who was their consumer that this would improve crop yield. And in the back of the farmer's mind, they probably were thinking, because farmers are some of the smartest people I've ever hung out with, they know their plants. And they know that stressing a plant leads to this effort to produce more fruit, because the plant thinks it's dying, so it's trying to get progeny out there. Mm-hmm. And so you will increase momentarily this yield, but then 3 years in, 7 years into a stressed out plant, this is so predictable. I mean, in the end, this isn't even surprising. If we putting a chemical into the soil that's robbing it of micronutrients, macronutrients, and medicinal quality for that plant, and we keep doing that, the plant is going to eventually go past the stress response of, okay, I'll make more fruit, to a continued stress response and running out of reservoir. Right. I'm stressed, but I can't respond. I can't get enough fruit out there, and I'm starting to really fail. And same thing in humans. Acute inflammation is life-saving. It extends life. It makes you stronger, not weaker. Chronic inflammation destroys you.
That's right.
And so the plant moves from an acute inflammatory kind of reaction of like, I'm stressed, I'm in an environment that's not going to sustain me well, I need to get progeny out there. Continue that injury, continue that injury, continue that injury and depletion, and then it goes into a chronic inflammatory state where the crop is seriously failing. Then you need to not only convince the farmer through biology, because there's many of them that were holdouts that said, look, I do not want some genetically modified weird seed that I can't own.
Right.
That puts me in too much dependence on you, Monsanto. I'm not doing that. I'm not taking that risk because I can see the writing on the wall. If I go GMO, I can't go back in time. I can't suddenly decide I'm going to be organic the next year. And so if I go GMO, I am fully dependent on what you think you can charge for that seed. And you can just keep ratcheting it up, and you'll keep it right under my profit margin so that I can survive, but I can never thrive. I'll never pay off my farm debt. I'll never pay off my loans to the bank. You're going to keep me dependent. And so the farmers, I think, saw that. They become
indentured servants at that point to Monsanto, not in control of their own destiny anymore.
If you can't own your own seed as a farmer, you've lost freedom. You've lost any potential of really breaking some sort of cycle and becoming independent.
So that's a deal with the devil if I've ever heard one, right?
Deal with the devil. And so who would do that? Mm-hmm. Well, again, this subtle, insidious reality of a patent sneaks in. They patented a seed. And you mentioned it just briefly earlier, is that when a seed goes through its process of making a crop and it goes into pollination, it's sending the genetically modified information in its pollen out to seed the rest of the farm. But of course, pollen is not limited to the farm.
Right.
The wind doesn't stop at the border, at the fence line.
Right.
And so you've got now GMO pollen. It's a freaky concept, right? Think about pollen. You wake up in the morning in Virginia where I live, and your whole car is covered with pollen from the trees and everything else, and your black car looks green. That tiny little powder that's going airborne and you're breathing it in and everything is genetically modified. Oof. The GMO, the genetically modified data that's making that corn grow resistant to Roundup, is now airborne and it's traveling across crops. And so it was easy. Monsanto just hired a bunch of lawyers, to go field to field and start suing farmers for intellectual property stealing. They were suing them for stealing their IP because they simply did a genetic test on the corn that was growing on the crops next to one of the Monsanto farms and said, oh, farmer B, C, and D, you guys are all growing genetically modified crops and you didn't buy seed from us. We own a patent on that. And they're like, we didn't buy seed from you.
That's right.
We don't want. Oh no, here's the genetic data. You have genetically modified crop growing in your thing.
Were they successful in that enforcement?
So successful that we went from just a few test plants in 1996, test fields, to by 10 years later, they owned 95% of the soybean industry and 85% of the corn industry. In 10 years, they took over the entire industry.
So let me get this straight as far as the theory of law. If somebody takes their intellectual property and irresponsibly forces it upon me, right?
Yes.
I don't want it. I don't want to accept it. I never asked for it. Yet I still have to pay. I mean, didn't they violate my rights to have my own seed and my own farm? Yet the courts...
Every single court case, again and again and again, successful suit after successful suit. Farmers were being sent into bankruptcy with these lawsuits.
I was going to say, because they probably couldn't even sustain the legal fees.
The legal onslaught was impossible.
So they had to surrender, basically saying...
They were selling their farm to pay for the legal fees.
Wow. Wow.
So this is how we turned, 2,000 acre farms into 100,000 acre farms. Sue the shit out of the little farmer until he can't afford to be in business, and then you allow the big Monsanto farm to buy that up, and you just create these massive conglomerates. And the technology allows for it, right? One farmer now with enough spraying equipment never has to weed, never has to go kill a single bug. They just grow more and more and more corn, and then the next year more and more and more soybean, and flip them back and forth, and pretty soon you just have tens of thousands of acres under one farm.
Is there any way to reverse the effects? I mean, now you have all these farms out there, all these GMO crops, the pollen's been blown all around. Is there any way to get back to, if we find out, wow, this is kind of a Frankenstein experience here and it's looking like it's going really bad, can we ever get back to a non-GMO'd approach toward food?
I'm an eternal optimist, and nature abhors the unnatural.
Right.
The natural is non-genetically modified food. It might take decades. We might see the extinction of humankind before it reverts back, but it will revert back because it's ultimately unstable. It's unnatural and it's unstable. I think we have completely screwed up the short-term forecast for our ability to have non-genetically modified compounds in our environment. It will take decades at least, maybe centuries, for us to get that completely out of the food chain.
So here we are in today's world. Now we've got a real context, and it's like a novel. It's hard to believe what unfolded and what the impetus was for how these things unfolded over time. And now here we are today in these circumstances that have emerged out of this. So where do you think it goes from here? I mean, what are you seeing as far as, Monsanto is going to be sold off? There seems to be some kind of disruption in the foundations of the businesses that foisted this upon us. So what's in process today, and where do you think it's going to end up?
So we're seeing again a plateau effect, and so 95% of the corn, soybean, 85% of the corn. Wheat is maxing out in the next couple of years. Every year since 1992, more wheat has been sprayed worldwide with that desiccant. So we're going to see those curves flattening because they've saturated the marketplace. So their profit margins are going to plateau. And they're, I think, looking at the industry of how could we possibly grow more. And the fact is they probably can't squeak out much more, especially because consumer behavior is starting to shift. And so they're saying if 16% of the consumers goes to organic in the U.S., we're going to lose those profit margins, and our market's going to start shrinking, not growing. And the interesting thing about big business is a plateau is not sustainable from a board standpoint. Your board's never happy if you say, well, we sold exactly as much as we did last year, let alone if we shrank 15%. Even if you're still selling $66 billion of Roundup a year, if last year you sold $68 billion, that's a failure. You know? And so we have this weird business model of the only definition of success is growth.
Right.
And so that leads to weird human behavior at the board level or at the CEO level or at these kind of big decision maker levels of this desperation and everything else. And so I think we see Monsanto, for example, with Roundup Ready crops worldwide now, they've saturated the marketplace. And so I think they see that their growth potential is low. So what's the only way that a company could reinvent that curve? And what is the only way we could start back over and get another steep trajectory of wealth for any company? Why would a Bayer go and buy a plateauing technology?
Because they feel like they can create a derivative technology that they can patent and expand their marketplace?
Yes, they would have to have something else up their sleeve.
Right.
And they do. And so shortly before the offer was made to buy Monsanto, they got approval from the EU and the US EPA to put a new GMO on the market.
The EU gave it to them also, huh?
The EU also.
Wow.
And so we have now the entire Western world ready to make a transition to a new GMO. That GMO is called Liberty Link, not Roundup. And so we have a company that's now going to buy Monsanto that owns 85 to 95% of our food chain in the US. We're selling that to a German company. Now think of this American farmer who's screwed, has to buy seed now from a German company. And yet our government has been bought so thoroughly by Monsanto saying we have to do this to feed the world, we have to do this for national security. Where's that argument now? Is it in our national security interest to give to a German company our food chain? They're going to pull Roundup Ready crops off the market as soon as it's not growing. As soon as that maxes out and they're not seeing growth there, now they pull that off the market and immediately put in Liberty Link worldwide, and they will see that crop take off. And so they'll get their own new massive burst. And I'm sure that glyphosate and Roundup will continue to be used all over the world, but its Liberty Link will have the new trajectory.
Wow, so basically it is literally a land grab. I mean, you know, it's saying, hey, if we, Bayer, who happens to be a drug manufacturer also, very interesting, are going to capture control of this massive marketplace. And now you're saying it's a new GMO and a new toxin and a pesticide, herbicide, what have you, that is going to be matched to the new GMO. New patents, new clock starts, the whole thing all over again. And how much research has been done on, what'd you call it, Liberty?
Liberty Link.
Liberty Link.
Isn't that
it's amazing how
doesn't that sound sneaky?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, who doesn't want Liberty Link, right? And so it's just
it's like all these bills that their names the opposite of what they are, because they just want to fool people. And has there been much study done on the toxicity of Liberty Link?
I can't even get Liberty Link in my lab.
Wow.
So I can't even start to do any third-party testing on that yet. And so, it's so covered up. It's just the same story again. There's not going to be any third-party data submitted before that. There wasn't before it got approved. It got approved. And so we're ready to move into widespread production with a completely new GMO, which, by the way, has a different amino acid blocked.
Wow. And
so the mathematical data is not looking good. Glyphosate, you take a look at the trajectory, 1990s to 2000s, and we've been talking about these business curves, of financial curves. Well, if we look at the chemical curves, it's very intense. We were talking about 100x and 1000x the profits and things like this. Every 6 years since the 1980s, we have sold twice as much glyphosate worldwide every 6 years. And so every 6 years you have a doubling of the production. What does that mean on a scale level? Last year, 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate were used worldwide.
2 billion kilos?
2 billion kilograms of a single chemical that would rob our soil of its nutrient and medicinal qualities, which would fail the plant's health, which would demand more chemical, herbicide, pesticide, more pharmaceutical management of those crops. 2 billion kilograms of a water-soluble toxin. What does that mean for human health? What does that mean for multicellular health? What does that mean for microcellular health on the planet? And those implications we could talk about forever, but the reality is we have introduced into human existence now something that is ubiquitous with our day-to-day lives. Recent studies coming out of the United States is that throughout the South, where we have high concentrations of all of the glyphosate in the country being funneled through the water systems, so again, only 1/10 of 1% hits a weed. The rest of it is into the soil, into the water, into the runoff from the farm, ending up where in the United States? In the Mississippi. The Mississippi River collects all of, some 80% of the Roundup sprayed in our country is ultimately going to be on one of those tributaries to the Mississippi River, and the highest concentrations will be in the last 90 miles of the Mississippi between Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Louisiana. And so that pattern there of this concentration is reflected in the air of the South. So 75% of the air samples taken are full of Roundup. 75% of the rainfall is contaminated with Roundup.
You're talking about down in New
Throughout
Orleans?
the South, yeah.
Throughout the South,
Yeah,
but
New
concentrated in
Orleans
that
will
area.
have the highest amounts.
Now, but that's not where it's sprayed.
No.
So this is clearly evidence that you're not creating a local phenomenon relative to, Roundup is sprayed here, so the effects of it are limited to this area. Oh, I live in an area where there is no farming or Roundup use, so I don't have to worry. Literally, you're seeing high concentrations in the air and the water distal from the place where it's actually used. The implications of that are horrifying.
They are worldwide.
Yeah.
They are worldwide. And there's certainly pockets of the earth right now where you can go and have less of this toxicity. But there's no place you can go on earth where there's none. 2 billion kilograms of a water-soluble toxin into our environment every year, which will double again in 6 years if we hold the patterns. And then we'll add Liberty Link. We are adding chemicals that will be in our environment for 50 to 60 years from today if we stop spraying today. And so we have 5 decades ahead of living a daily biology with Roundup.
Here's another contradiction that's starting to emerge in my mind relative to all this. It's about feeding the hungry, feeding the poor, etc. But literally, the people who have the best opportunity to try to avoid as much of the toxicity and adverse health effects of GMOs are the wealthy, right? We can go buy organic foods and non-GMO foods, et cetera, and also probably have a better understanding of all the dynamics of what's going on. But I look at the people who are not in a position to do that, and they become the biggest victims of the whole, I don't know if there's a better term than conspiracy, but the whole dynamics of what's going on between the lobby in Washington, big corporate interest, and over 2 billion kilograms of a toxin that's set out and unleashed into the world.
The sad reality of both the socioeconomic features as well as the biology that you're speaking to is that there is going to continue to unfortunately be a selective and racial disparity in the way in which this toxicity plays out in the biology. We are already seeing the genocide. African Americans are dying at a much higher rate from chronic kidney disease and cancers than their wealthy Caucasian neighbors. And so even in the same neighborhoods, we see the biology playing out differently. It's a tragedy that instead of valuing diversity at the microscopic level or at the crop level, we are seeing the correlate in the human context. Is that if we destroy biodiversity in our fields, and we are growing tens of thousands of acres in a row of just corn, we are going to genetically grow very narrow bandwidth of human biology as well. There will be a small sector of humans that are more resistant to this toxicity, and it's probably goes beyond race. It's little quirks in the gut genome or the bacteria there. But the reality is we are seeing an insidious genocide happen on this planet right now worldwide that is going to be selectively hitting the lower socioeconomic and in our country the minority classes here. And so if we take a step back now from a geopolitical standpoint and say, is this new? Is this just some conspiracy theory that we're now highlighting in a documentary? The answer is no. History is repeating itself over and over again. In the 1940s, where we started this story, was World War II. Bayer was the main pharmaceutical arm within the Nazi regime in Germany. And Bayer was owned by this FK pharmaceutical company. And Bayer was the one that was doing research on sterilization of the Jews. And so we have these chemical companies that were all this conglomerate that were carrying out human biologic experiments in sterilization. And we had a huge outcry from the public when we uncovered this in the 40s and 50s. This is disgusting. This is horrible that we would have done this to this effort of genocide. And now, of course, we've seen chemical warfare used through the effort of genocide in Rwanda and other places since then. Genocide is not a new effort by our governments or by our political movements or anything else. But this is the first time we've cloaked it in a non-war context. We've cloaked it in the Green Revolution initially in the 1950s and 60s. It sounds so altruistic. And then finding a niche for the chemical farmer, we said, oh, well, your new cloak is you are the altruistic farmer that's feeding the world and preventing global starvation because we have 7 billion people. False all the way through in so many levels, but at the same time, it has shielded the attention of the public to this insidious genocide that I believe is going on.
This is all disturbing, not only in just the sheer practicality of what's happening to human beings health-wise, et cetera, but also just the moral implications, and the political implications which would stem from that morality, and how all of this can get bought, through lobby and dollars in varying democracies, or so-called democracies, and the consequences of which are incalculable.
Yes.
So is this unconscionable dynamic of, what would be called, in my mind, not real capitalism, but a crony capitalism, where favors can be bought, rights can be bought, that there's not a free market to make these decisions, but there's a force of government that can, and corporate interests that can suddenly now own our farmers, bring them to their knees, drive all this into our environment, and victimize many people who can have no choice in the matter. This is an unnerving situation that you describe here. So I'm looking forward to now digging into more detail around some of these issues with you, but I want to first thank you for the overview, because so much of what we hear relative to GMOs and the debate about GMOs and Roundup and the health toxicity, I think all those things, of course, are of consequence, and they're narrow conversations or debates. But I believe it's important for people to truly understand that they have to, really kind of look at how the whole thing unfolded over time, over decades. So thank you for bringing that context, and I'm looking forward to these additional conversations.
It's very exciting. I appreciate the in-depth quality of this. Ultimately, what we're going to find is that the consumer is as responsible as the chemical companies as to where we landed in this story today. Mm-hmm. And that's so empowering, and it's so important. This is why it's the opposite of a conspiracy theory story. In a conspiracy theory, just Darth Vader sweeps in and does something bad. But I think what we've painted today is there has been a predictable march of business that has been mirrored or paralleled by consumer behavior, which is we have been going for decades after this simple reality of convenience. Our behavior of convenience lifestyle has mandated the existence of chemical farming. And it's so exciting that that's the reality, because as dismal as this story may look, and as sad and tragic as it truly is already, there is an instant relief valve. There's an escape button, there's an eject button that we can hit right now by empowering the consumer with this information and changing their behavior. I liken this to the tobacco industry. As a young doctor in the early 90s going through medical school and everything else, I was watching, with rapt attention the grand jury hearings we were having on the tobacco industry and its relationship to cancer and addiction. And we saw 13 or so CEOs of all these massive tobacco companies stand up before Congress, hand on the Bible, and swear that cigarettes were neither causing cancer or addictive. At that point, as scientists, I think we kind of gave up. Like, we had just presented Congress with 40 years of linear data of this is how cigarettes cause lung cancer, this is how it destroys the immune system, this is how it's causing the problem. And then to watch just 13 business guys say, no, it's not true. I swear it's not addictive. And then watch Congress sit back down and not move on that and maybe stiffen their language slightly on a package. And then just 10 years later, by 2002, the consumer changed. The legislation didn't change, the science didn't change, the doctors didn't get better at telling the story, but the consumer suddenly realized, I don't want emphysema and lung cancer. And I don't want it for my children, and I don't want it for my grandchildren. And so they changed. And within 10 years, the tobacco industry really collapsed in the United States because the consumer changed. Mm-hmm. And that was a powerful message to how powerful the consumer is. But think about that for a moment. Not everybody smoked. And yet consumer behavior changed that, revolutionized that. Everybody eats. And everybody today, whether you're trying to eat organic or not, everybody is eating glyphosate. Everybody is drinking glyphosate. Everybody is breathing glyphosate. Everybody is rained on by glyphosate. And so when the consumer knows this knowledge, can you imagine how fast we can turn that ship around?
And that is a power to the people, phenomenon, right?
Yes.
Because this is where Rand described in The Fountainhead. I remember that a leash, because they think they can they have everybody on a leash, is a rope with a noose on both ends. And I think if there's the only answer is a consumer revolution, right? The only answer is that to undermine the whole thing is for consumers to vote differently with their pocketbooks and to vote differently when they go to the ballot box.
Yes.
Well,
and I like it. The other side of the leash is the hand, and all the dog has to do is turn around and chase to the nearest thing, and it's going to bite that hand off.
That's right.
We will bite the hand off, which will release the leash.
Yeah.
If we just get together. And ultimately, this is a story of relationship. You and I have an amazing relationship in a short period of time because we share passion.
Right.
Everybody on planet Earth right now can share one passion, is we want our children to survive.
Yeah.
If that's our common scenario, then the story we've told today is the most important thing for you to know. And it's the most important thing at your next family gathering, at your next business event, at your next luncheon, to talk about this. We need to get the leash off, and we need to start relationship again. With who? With our local farmer. Empower that CSA near you, and empower your backyard. If you have a strip of grass, that could become 6 tomato plants. Grow your own food. If you grow 1,000th of your food, you're making progress for our country. You're making progress for the planet Earth. And so the message is that the consumer not only can change the ballot box, we can literally change where our food comes from by growing just a few plants. If you live in a city, if you're in New York City, grow a basil plant in your window. You'll change the scales just by that one action.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing the passion, the wisdom, and the research that you've done, and looking forward to continued conversations.
Thanks for the time.
So ironically, Jeffrey, I'm driving up to do this interview in Petaluma, California, and I see this big old bank building, and it's a seed bank, and there's a sign that says, "Keep Sonoma County GMO free." What are the chances?
And finally, they put the valued stuff in the bank vault now, the seeds and not just the money. Yeah, the Baker Creek Heirloom Seed Organization, they have a great heirloom expo every year in Santa Rosa in September. A lot of the GMO voices are there speaking. I'm keynoting there. In fact, I'm going to be showing excerpts of our new film, Secret Ingredients, there.
That's terrific. So just for our audience now, tell us your name and give us a brief bio sketch.
Sure. Jeffrey Smith. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology. I wrote the book Seeds of Deception, which became the world's best-selling book on GMOs, and talked about the health dangers and the corruption behind the approval and promotion of GMOs, both within industry and the government. I also have the book Genetic Roulette, which is the documented health risks of all GMOs, as well as 3 movies right now, including Genetic Roulette, the Gamble of Our Lives, which is now lively around the world.
Terrific.
Oh, and I've been doing this for 21 years, and I've been to 45 countries.
So 21 years ago you got started. What caused you to get on this path?
Well, I went to a lecture by a scientist who was a genetic engineer blowing the whistle on the technology. He was very intimately connected with the process of genetic engineering and knew that the most common result was surprise side effects. So he knew that the technology was not ready for prime time, certainly not ready to put into the food supply, where everyone who eats could be affected negatively. And he knew that the level of evaluations of the GMOs in terms of its impact on health was incredibly superficial. He also was aware that once you put the genes out there in the terms of the crops, they'll cross-pollinate, they'll mix, and there's no recall. So we're permanently changing the gene pool of all future generations, affecting everyone who eats. And this was in 1996, just before they were about to plant GMOs in the state that I was living in Iowa, in a vast way, and hardly anyone knew about it. So my background is as a communicator, strategic communicator, educator, et cetera. And I realized this guy speaking science is not going to make it into the decision maker's thinking. It's not going to get out. What I need to do is help translate the science into English, into words that people understand, and maybe that'll help. So I had this idea of how we could help, and I've been doing that ever since, translating science into English. And I've spoken to scientists all over the world, and that's in my books and movies and articles, etc. And it turns out that if you translate it, you take the mystery out of these GMOs that are supposed to be all safe and whatnot, and you realize actually these guys are totally off base. They have no idea what the impacts will be. It's all based mostly on assumptions, and most of the fundamental assumptions used as the basis for safety claims turn out to be false. So when you get into the details and you explain it so that everyone can understand, you're not just like, trust us, we're experts, then real people realize, no way do I want to put that in my mouth. And so the strategy which we at the Institute for Responsible Technology have undertaken was to use behavior change messaging. What is it that you need to know so that you are really convinced you better not put this in your mouth, especially your children's mouth, if at all possible? And so we've made that very public and very popular. And as a result now, a tipping point of consumer rejection is underway in the United States, where more and more companies are eliminating GMOs because they're becoming a marketing liability.
So we're at the tipping point now. This is 21 years after you start your journey.
It took a little longer than I thought.
Yeah, I was about to say, what were your expectations in the beginning? Did you think that pretty immediately there'd be an outrage about it, or did you think it was going to be a long road?
Well, I didn't think I'd be here 21 years later. I figured getting the information to key people. But then as I looked into it, a lot of those key people had already been turned, biased, or bought off. I think you probably know that the person in charge of policy at the FDA was Monsanto's former attorney, Michael Taylor, later Monsanto's vice president, then back at the FDA as the U.S. food czar. He was put there because the White House had instructed the FDA to promote GMOs. And so the whole thing was a rigged game from the beginning. So based on a single sentence of the FDA policy, where it claimed that they didn't see any significant difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, they allowed Monsanto to put GMOs on the market without a single safety study. And so you don't even have to tell the FDA that you're putting a GMO on the market according to that policy. The same company that told us that DDT and Agent Orange and PCBs were safe can determine the safety of the food. And it turns out that the sentence upon which the entire policy was created was a lie. The overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was that GMOs were different and dangerous and needed to be tested. So the entire approval and promotion of GMOs was based on industry manipulation and political collusion.
And over these decades of collusion, is any of this coming to see the light of day from a legal or legislative side, not just on the consumer revolution side?
Well, legal and legislative, not so much. It's interesting. A friend of mine was filing a class action against Monsanto. It was turned down. After the whole thing ended, the New York Times outed the judge. Mm-hmm. The judge never admitted or acknowledged that he was actually Monsanto's attorney in the previous life, and that was their, judge. There was the attorney on record, and never mentioned it, never recused himself. Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, former Monsanto attorney, wrote the position for the majority of a decision that was in favor of Monsanto. So there's a lot of legislative tinkering. We have won some. Center for Food Safety has done a great job of stopping at one point the alfalfa, which then got reversed. They stopped the pharmaceutical crops in Hawaii and other things. So we have had rulings go our way. If you look at a strategic understanding of GMOs in terms of fighting against GMOs, there's two basic philosophies. Contain or eliminate. Contain is try and prevent the next approval, or try and not in my backyard, or GM-free zones, like we're in Sonoma County, it's GM-free zone, or eliminate GMOs. And that's what the Institute for Responsible Technology is focused on. Let's eliminate all GMOs. They shouldn't be in the food supply. They shouldn't be released outdoors. Maybe someday they can manipulate genes in a way that's predictable and precise, that they can benefit in human health and the environment. But we're nowhere near that day. We have so many untested assumptions, and so many of the assumptions have been proven false.
I was going to say the assumptions were bigger crop yields, no adverse effects. So what do you see? Because here's some of the things, even people who've been in this docuseries, some have said, well, GMOs in and of themselves, I don't think present a problem. It's just the glyphosate that they spray on is the problem. What's your opinion on that?
All right. So Seralini, a French toxicologist, and his team studied Roundup-ready corn. Corn engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide. And they fed it to rats, and the rats had multiple massive tumors. They died earlier. They had organ damage, liver, kidneys, pituitary. So what was it? Was it the glyphosate? Was it the Roundup as a whole, or was it the GMO? Well, they designed the study to help find that out. In addition to the group of rats that ate the sprayed corn, another group of rats ate the corn that was never sprayed, just the GMO. And they also had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So you'd think, it's the GMO. But another group was fed Roundup in the drinking water without the GMO corn, and they also had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So was it the food, or was it the spray? Yes.
Yeah, all
it was both, exactly. Now, if you took the Roundup-ready corn, what could possibly be wrong with that? Well, they put this out on the market without doing the close evaluation of what actually gets damaged and changed as a result of the process of genetic engineering. Michael Antonio and others, a scientist from London, he actually analyzed the full protein expression and the metabolite expression of these Roundup-ready corn kernels and found there were over 200 proteins and metabolites that were different than the same corn that had been not GMO'd. Now, the difference among those over 200, some of them we don't know. We don't know the impact. But for two, we do. Putrescine and cadaverine. Think of those names.
Yeah, I was going to say putrid and cadavers.
Exactly. They are the elements that cause foul, rotting dead bodies to smell.
Right.
Okay? They're in higher levels in the Roundup-ready corn. And they're linked to allergies and cancer. So you're eating the Roundup-ready corn, you might end up with allergic reactions, you might end up with cancer, whether or not it's been sprayed. Another BT toxin corn, a corn that produces its own toxic insecticide that breaks open the holes of the walls of the guts of insects to kill them. In addition to that toxin, and we can talk about the dangers there, it also has a new allergen. The gene was already in the corn, but it was never switched on until the process of genetic engineering caused that change. So the process of genetic engineering causes massive collateral damage in the DNA. Hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA, changes in gene expression in dozens or 100 or more different genes, and that's the result of the side effects of genetic engineering. The most clear result, the most clear example of this was done by Dr. Arpad Pusztai, and he was working in Aberdeen at the Rowett Institute. And he took potatoes engineered to produce an insecticide and fed them to rats. But he fed another group of rats natural potatoes. Another group of rats were fed natural potatoes plus the same insecticide that the GMO potato produced in the same quantity. So we had natural, GMO, and natural plus the insecticide. Only the rats fed the GMO showed potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive system, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system.
Wow.
It was not the insecticide. So what was it? It was the process of genetic engineering that caused the problem.
What happened to these results? I mean, did they get released? Did people not look at them? I mean, why?
Very good question.
Yeah.
So he was a pro-GMO scientist, paid $3 million by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. And he was shocked when he discovered the problems. He was absolutely shocked. And he was invited on television around the time that he discovered this. With permission from his director, he was interviewed for national UK television, and in the 2.5-minute interview, he mentioned that rats that were fed GMOs in his experiments had problems, and that he didn't think it was wise to use the human population as guinea pigs. Well, all hell broke loose, and it was like one of the world's top scientists in his field, and he truly was saying that GMOs were unsafe. He had been the one trying to create the protocols to test for them, and now he was saying that the entire enterprise was a problem. So the director was thinking, oh, this is great research, and started taking over all of the calls from the press and put out his own press release. And 2 days later, two calls from the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director, resulted in Dr. Pustai being fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. They withdrew his data, they never implemented the protocols, and they embarked on a 7-month program to destroy his reputation in order to protect the reputation of GMOs. Then, by an order of Parliament, he was able to speak. He got his data back. It's published in The Lancet and elsewhere. And it demonstrates that the process of genetic engineering, irrespective of what gene you put in, whether it's to create Roundup Ready, to create Bt toxin, whatever, this is the process of inserting that gene, either through a gene gun or through bacterial infection, plus cloning that cell into a plant, causes such unpredicted side effects that it damaged virtually every system and organ tested in these animals in just 10 days.
Isn't it a hubris to think that you can tamper with such things and it's just going to have a straight A to B effect that's known speculatively?
Well, it's hubris if you think about the tradition of biology, looking at the DNA, where they explained it all. Our DNA creates RNA, creates proteins. It's just one direction, one protein creates one traits. They were very, very certain that it was true, and it was all wrong. A professor told me it used to take 1 day in a semester, one class, to teach what a gene was. Now it takes an entire semester. It's so much more complicated. They used to say, oh, there's 2% of the genome are actually functioning genes that produce proteins. We'll just call the rest junk. So they just called the rest junk. I was sitting with a Monsanto scientist at lunch. He didn't know what I did, and I just discovered when he sat down with me that he was a Monsanto scientist that did safety studies. And so I asked him, I said, when you insert the gene into the genome, you damage part of the genome. I mean, you could damage all over the genome, but particularly in the area that you insert. And I said, how do you know that the area that you're inserting the gene into is not an important area? And he said, well, we're discovering more and more which areas are important. I'm thinking, you've already released food, and crops for a decade. It's about time. And then I said, well, what if the entire genome was important? What if it operates with levels of science that we don't even understand yet? What if there's quantum mechanical or quantum field effects that you cannot evaluate at this point? And he looked at me, and then he looked down at his food, and he just kept eating. And there was and his friend that came in with him said, that was deep. And he just kept eating. 2 minutes of complete silence. And he looked up and said, but we need genetic engineering. So he couldn't answer the question. He just wanted to say it was worth the risk. And I said, why? He said, because in 2040 there's going to be X number of people and we need to increase the yield. So he was convinced that GMOs would increase yield, even though we all know that GMOs actually do not increase yield. Many of them lower average yield, and that organic and agroecological systems can double yield in developing countries. So he was completely wrong about that, but that was his excuse for tampering with a system that he knew he did not understand.
Can you imagine the horror of somebody who thinks they're doing good for humanity? Because he's obviously not on top of the food chain, in the back room with the board of directors figuring out how to, protect their stakeholder, equity value in sense. But can you imagine the horror of somebody who thinks they're doing something good for humanity, maybe much like the guy did in Aberdeen, right? But then to look and say, oh my God, you're right, there's potential consequences here. We thought we were feeding the hungry.
I deal with that all the time. Scientists who think that GMOs are a good thing until they hear from me or others about the details. But there's also this compartmentalization. I was in South Africa with a guy who developed for Monsanto genetically modified sugar cane. And started out with like 15, it's a 15-year process. It was normally to develop something. And he spent all this time and all this money developing a sugar cane that was genetically engineered, and then he had to bury it because no one wanted it. There was no market for it. So I tricked him a little. And I said, so you handle the selection to find the agronomic properties, and Monsanto does the safety studies. He goes, that's right. I said, so you do your work, and over the 15 years, and they do the long-term animal feeding studies, the intergenerational feeding studies, the human feeding trials. He goes, that's right. And I went out a little bit. And then I told him, no, they don't. They don't do any of that. They don't do those long-term animal feeding studies. The longest animal feeding study they do is 90 days. And I was told by a former Monsanto scientist that they actually fed genetically modified corn to rats for 90 days. The rats developed serious problems. Instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. So they do superficial work. They do tobacco science, designing it specifically to avoid finding problems. And this guy had no idea. He was doing his compartmentalization work. Someone else is doing their compartmentalization work. I would say the epidemic that allows GMOs on the market is this concept that someone else has taken care of it and they're doing a good job. Even the governments that I talk to, I'm sometimes flown by a government to give a talk here or whatnot, or I speak to government people, and they say, well, the FDA approved it, so we don't have to worry about it. The FDA doesn't approve GMOs. They have a voluntary consultation process, which is better known as a meaningless exercise, at the end of which they issue a piece of paper which says, to Monsanto, for example, Monsanto believes its foods are safe. And this is to verify that it is Monsanto's responsibility to make that determination. They never say, this GMO is safe. They never approve it. It's just a meaningless exercise. And the rest of the world thinks that GMOs are safe because somehow the FDA gave its approval.
So does the FDA have a different set of standards for other foods that are trying to get marketed as compared to GMOs? I mean, is it literally like they get a free pass in GMOs but not in other places?
Sort of. You would think that if you're adding something into the food, it would be considered a food additive.
Right.
And there's a food additive evaluation that's required, and labeling is required for that. In order to not require an evaluation, you can label something as generally recognized as safe, but for that, the traditional criteria in the courts was several peer-reviewed studies, or the equivalent, and a consensus among the scientific peers. Well, GMOs had neither of those. But Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, created the policy that determined that GMOs were generally recognized as safe, violating the law, according to some independent lawyers, and allowing GMOs in the market in a way that bypassed the normal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requirements.
So this is crazy in a sense, or maybe completely crazy, that once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't really put it back in. And these government agencies are charged with protecting us, and the faith of the people are in those agencies. Because I know when I have these conversations, a lot of people say, oh, well, the government would shut it down if it was unsafe, so you must, thinking I must be crazy. But reality is, there have been some studies showing that there are really pretty bad adverse effects of eating GMO food, independent of what's sprayed on them, and that they've been let out of the bottle, so to speak. As a matter of fact, Monsanto sues farmers, right, if their seeds happen to blow into adjacent fields. Absolutely. So not only is it the matter that they're out there, but then they can foist it upon others who don't even want it as far as their farming practices.
And there's no recall. If once it's released into the environment, it's a self-propagating pollution of the gene pool. And so the only thing that lasts longer than genetic pollution of the gene pool is extinction. Extinction lasts forever. But until then, you've got Monsanto.
Wow. Now, there's been a lot of consumer attention on this now. But one other thing that boggles my mind is the whole labeling aspect of this, where basically we're saying, okay, we haven't gotten rid of GMOs. Maybe we can't to some degree right now, but can we at least have it labeled so that a consumer can know what they're buying? And what's the rationale for not labeling them?
Well, if they followed the law and declared it as a food additive, it would require labeling. They didn't. And they knew that if it were labeled, some people wouldn't want it, and it would destroy the economic basis for genetic engineering of food. And so the FDA knew that. They had done their own research, and so they realized we don't want it labeled in order to protect the industry, even though 90 to 93% of Americans want GMOs labeled.
But their charters protect the people, not the industry.
If you talk to people in the government, they often talk about their clients.
Their clients?
The FDA clients are the drug companies and the biotech companies. That's their clients. People who are independent there complain about that term, but that's how it's designed. It's designed for promoting the interests of the businesses that they are supposed to regulate. And there's a revolving door. For example, Monsanto has bovine growth hormone. It's a genetically engineered drug. It's now owned by Eli Lilly, but it was introduced by Monsanto, injected into dairy cows to increase the milk supply. The person who was in charge of the review of that was a former contractor to Monsanto who did work on bovine growth hormone. Then there was someone who did an article or did a study for Monsanto, who worked for Monsanto, a scientist. She then became the head of a division that reviewed her own study. And then Michael Taylor was on top. And so this cabal approved genetically engineered bovine growth hormone. Now there was one scientist, actually a veterinarian there, Richard Burroughs, who complained and said, you can't allow this drug on the market like this with this superficial testing, and he ordered more tests. They fired him and then canceled the tests. He sued, and at the trial, his boss admitted that he was set up to be kicked out because he was slowing down the approval process. So the whole concept of the FDA is for the people has actually been proven and demonstrated not to be true for decades. The person who founded the FDA, within a decade or two, mourned about the direction that the FDA had taken early last century. And Senate hearings have uncovered this kind of corrupt basis of the FDA. So to say that the FDA approves something and therefore it's safe, I mean, just within drugs, within a year and a half of approval, half of the drugs approved within a year and a half had to either be removed or relabeled as more dangerous, and that's after $100 million or so per drug. With GMOs, you don't have to do any of that research, and the voluntary consultation process is if the FDA person asks you a question to verify or to evaluate something, you can ignore them. And you'll still get the piece of paper saying you think your GMOs are safe.
And this is what's seemingly tragic, is that in drug approval, you're right, there's got to be extraordinary amounts of data.
And they still get it wrong.
Yeah. And they still get it wrong even after all that. You're right, over 100,000 people per year die in the United States as a result of prescription drugs when they're properly prescribed because of unanticipated adverse effects. But these are subpopulations that are even taking this. With GMOs, we're talking about the food supply. I mean, for everybody, the whole food supply, and they have none of those barriers up to try to at least get some filtering and safety data to see if this is a reasonable thing to do. And it's been going on now for over 20 years. So what are you seeing as far as people, their health, what they're experiencing out there, because you're in the thick of it?
Well, if you look at the post-marketing surveillance, there is none. In fact, Canadian Health Canada, their version of the FDA, announced in 2002, we're going to monitor the health of Canadians to see if there's any adverse effects. By the next year, they said, it's too difficult, we canceled that. The UK government, a big pro-GMO cheerleader in the late 90s, said GMOs are safe. They quietly asked the supermarkets to provide the data from the loyalty cards so they could track what people were eating, which were GMOs, to see if it was related to cancer, allergies, etc. And when that was discovered, the embarrassed government canceled that. So no one is looking. Now, as I was traveling around the world, speaking about the dangers of GMOs, I was representing a lot of scientists who I had interviewed. And every time I wrote something that I thought that they said, I'd show them to make sure it was exactly right. And they were impressed that it was actually translated into English and didn't have to use these jargon. And I was also being approached by people from time to time who said, you know, I can tell the difference when I eat GMOs versus non-GMOs. And I didn't believe them. I figured, well, you know, how can you know? And I just figured that if there was a change, it was going to be some kind of subtle shift in some kind of statistics about certain type of diseases. But I didn't expect people to actually be sensitive enough to feel the difference. I wrote the book Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods, in 2007. And so just before that, in 2006, I had compiled all the information and started presenting it at medical conferences. And the doctors started prescribing non-GMO diets based on the weight of the evidence. And one organization, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, had me regularly, and I was describing the impact of GMOs on whatever the theme that year was, whether it was cancer or autoimmune disease or whatever, and all the information that I could gather from the scientists and the scientific literature. So they actually did their own evaluation of GMOs. Having heard this, they said, we should check it out ourselves. And this organization was like the first organization, their members in their organization, to identify food allergies and Gulf War syndrome and a number of other things, because they're the cutting edge. And so they did their own evaluation of the animal feeding studies in 2008 and said, actually, the evidence was overwhelming. Actually, 2009, the evidence was overwhelming that GMOs actually caused problems in the lab animals, and that there was problems with the organ damage and reproductive system and immune system and accelerated aging and all sorts of issues. And they said all doctors should recommend non-GMO diets and that should be withdrawn. So I went that same year. I received an award from this organization, but I brought a camera. I started interviewing the doctors, and some of the interviews are in my movie Genetic Roulette. And the doctors were speaking differently than the scientists. The scientists, you know, they may say converging lines of evidence suggest that I might be chilly. You know, they don't want to say anything with definiteness. Right. No cause, you know. But these doctors were saying, you know, actually GMOs are causing problems in our patients. We can see, an allergist told me his allergic patients had higher levels of allergies with the GMOs. Someone told me that all of her patients, when she prescribes non-GMOs, they all get better. I went, what percentage? I was skeptical. She said, I told you all of them, 100%. Okay, 98% show improvement. And I said, how many patients have you prescribed non-GMO diets to? And she took a little moment, and she actually calculated the number of patients she saw, et cetera. She looked up and she said, about 5,000.
Wow.
And I realized this one doctor had done more experiments on GMO versus non-GMO than all of the scientists put together for their rats and mice. And I said, can I come to your clinic and talk to your patients? So I brought a video camera there, interviewed the patients, and I was shocked. They were describing, you know, getting rid of symptoms of Crohn's disease in 3 days, irritable bowel in 3 weeks, another person 6 weeks, a young boy, problems with asthma and migraines, gone, another one, wrenching gut pain, gone. And another went to another place, same kind of thing. And there was a question, because some of these people were also taken onto organic, put onto non-processed foods. Some of them had, you know, were taken off of gluten, some taken off of dairy. It's like, well, what's the actual cause? If you're changing all these things at one time, you don't know.
Right.
So I started interviewing farmers around the same time, and they told me about their pigs and cows being put on non-GMO corn or soybeans. And they're not gluten-free pigs, no dairy-free cows. And sure enough, they were getting better from the same type of things that the people were reporting in these offices. Then I started to pay more attention. And I came out with the film Genetic Roulette and started interviewing audience members and saying, okay, how many people noticed an improvement in your health or energy or vitality, whatever, when you switched to a non-GMO diet? And a bunch of hands go up. I said, okay, describe to me what. So someone would say, okay, reduced allergies. And it's okay, how many people noticed an improvement in allergies or any type of immune system? And someone said reduced weight, another person, their kidney issue. And I noticed a trend. And now it's been about 150 lectures. And the number one reported improvement is always gastrointestinal. But it could be irritable bowel, it could be acid reflux, Crohn's disease, a lot of different aspects of digestion. The number two, I would always ask it combining two different ones, was increased energy and reduced brain fog. It was always number 2, or even some cases the same. And then there was reduction in weight, reduction in pain, better mood and behavior, so less depression and anxiety. One time a woman yelled from the back of the room, erectile dysfunction. So I immediately said, okay, raise your hand if you had erectile dysfunction. So there was a lot of different symptoms being described as getting better. And it was so consistent in its pattern that we put out a questionnaire to our list at the Institute for Responsible Technology, and over 3,200 people responded. And the symptoms were in the exact same order that I had seen in these interviews of audiences. And they were the exact same that I had talked to when I spoke to medical conferences, which I do regularly several times a year. Their patients, same improvements.
With all this health data that you're getting, have you done any publishing on it?
Well, actually, right now I'm finishing up an article for a functional medicine journal, peer-reviewed, which goes into all the ways that GMOs might actually be contributing to diseases and disorders. And it focuses just on the primary one, the number one, which is gastrointestinal. But it does talk about, in this case, the epidemiological evidence, the data that shows things like inflammatory bowel going up in parallel with the increased use of GMOs or the glyphosate-based herbicides sprayed on those GMOs. Now, it's interesting that if you look at 30 or 35 or 40 different diseases in the United States, they're all going up in parallel with the increased use of GMOs or the Roundup that's sprayed on those GMOs. We're talking autism, diabetes, deaths from obesity, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, high blood pressure, kidney disease, deaths near end-stage kidney failure, leukemia, several types of cancer. And the list is long, even ADHD and suicides. Mm-hmm. Now you think, why is it, or how is it, that GMOs could possibly contribute to all of these different diseases? And so we tackle that in this paper, primarily around the gastrointestinal, but I'm looking forward to doing others around the different diseases. But here's what we looked at. We focused on 3 different categories of possible causes, because you have a similar pattern. You have the animal feeding studies showing a bunch of categories of diseases, people getting better from those same categories of diseases, livestock and pets, when they switch to non-GMO, getting better from those same category of diseases. And those category of diseases are on the rise in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced, rising in parallel. So there's enough evidence for a thinking person to think, I better wonder if this is safe or not. How is it that GMOs might be related, on the one hand, to diabetes, on the other hand, to a cancer, etc.? So we look at 3 categories. The first category is the genetic engineering process itself. We covered that already. The process can create, as the FDA scientists said back in the early 90s, it could increase allergens, toxins, create nutritional problems, even lead to new diseases. In that case, antibiotic-resistant diseases. And they laid it all out and were ignored. So because you're like throwing a dart at the genome and destroying part of it, or overproducing something which can change other things, you can end up with all sorts of changes. In Monsanto's soy, they have up to 7 times the amount of a known allergen in cooked GM soy compared to cooked non-GM soy. They have a doubling of a soy lectin, which blocks the absorption of certain nutrients. So there's all sorts of changes that can occur just because of the process of genetic engineering itself. The second category is from the corn that produces its own toxic insecticide called Bt toxin. Bt toxin comes from the Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis. It's bacteria, soil bacteria. And it produces a natural toxin that pokes holes in the guts of insects, certain insects, and kills them. Causes the bacteria from inside the gut to get into the whole system, and there's an infection, and it wipes them out. So they use this spore and bacteria from the Bt to spray on plants when there's times of high infestation of certain bugs. It kills the bugs, then it biodegrades, and it washes off. But the biotechnologists, in their infinite wisdom, the brain cell behind genetic engineering, decided to put the gene from the bacterium into the corn plant. and it's in every single cell of the corn. And it produces the Bt toxin thousands of times greater concentration than is used in the spray. The spray washes off and biodegrades, but not when it's inside the corn kernel. It stays there. So when we eat the corn, we get a heavy dose of the Bt toxin, far greater than it was ever given to humans before. And even the stuff given to humans in its natural form was considered dangerous. You'd have warnings on the side of the can when it was sprayed for gypsy moth infestation by plane. Over about 500 people reported symptoms. Some had to go to the hospital. They found antibody responses in farm workers working with it. So there was evidence that this toxin was dangerous even on its own. But here, it's molecularly designed to be even more toxic. It's higher concentration. It doesn't wash off, and we're eating it. So one of the aspects of the Bt toxin is it promotes immune system response. It does it in humans. It does it in animals, according to the peer-reviewed research. And so we would expect that anything that's related to the immune system that we see as a possible result of eating genetically engineered food could possibly be triggered from the Bt toxin. But the other piece is this. The Bt toxin was supposed to be inert for mammals, completely benign. They actually, in Seralini's team, in 2012, published an article in the Journal of Applied Toxicology and found that when they put the Bt toxin from Monsanto's corn on human cells, it poked holes in those cells, and they were the same type of pores that were the ones that killed animals, or killed the insects. The same type of pore that killed the insects was found in the human cells in these test tubes. And it was at a higher concentration that is generally found in food, but there's possible ways that you don't need that much concentration with food. There's ways that they never tested on humans, they never tested on animals, just in a test tube. So we're eating a corn that can possibly poke holes in the walls of our intestines. Now the intestines walls are only one cell thick. If you can poke a hole in that, that's leaky gut, permeable gut. And then you end up with a system that is correlated with cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, inflammation, autoimmune disease, and allergies, among others. And the issue is that if you create those holes, then undigested proteins and bacteria and other things can get into the bloodstream. Now, in Canada, they found 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood. It may have gone through the holes that it created. We don't know. If it gets in the blood, it could be toxic to the blood cells, which was discovered in a mouse experiment where it was toxic to the blood cells. With 93% of the pregnant women tested and about 2/3 of the non-pregnant women having Bt toxin in their blood, this was in Canada, the Bt toxin should wash out quickly. It's not Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day.
Right.
What was the source of the Bt toxin that such a high percentage of the people had it in their blood? Well, most of the corn that's eaten in Canada is highly processed corn syrup, corn oil. There's no Bt toxin. The scientists, the authors, speculated that it was eating the milk and meat of animals that were fed the Bt corn and Bt cotton meal throughout their lives, and that it somehow survived in the animal tissue or was produced into the milk or dairy products. Now there's another plausible explanation, which is kind of dangerous or kind of scary. In the only human feeding study ever conducted on a commercialized edible GMO, they used one meal, but they found that part of the gene of the soybean, the transgene inserted into the soybean to make it Roundup ready, so you can spray the soy field with Roundup and not kill the soy, part of that gene transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside the intestines of some of these subjects. Now, it was integrated into the DNA. It became part of the DNA. They never were able to find out if it also was functioning, if it produced this Roundup Ready protein. If it did, it means that we're converting our intestinal flora into factories to produce these genetically engineered proteins. Now, what if you eat a corn chip made of Bt corn? And if the Bt gene transfers to your gut bacteria. And your gut bacteria start producing Bt toxin 24/7 inside your own intestines. That might explain why 93% of the pregnant women in Canada tested had Bt toxin in their blood, because they might have been producing it inside their own intestines. This is one of the many serious potential health effects that have never been evaluated by the FDA or the companies that produce GMOs.
Yeah, I mean, some of these things you can't even try to anticipate. I mean, that's why testing, I guess, would be required over some protracted period of time, saying there's no way to even try to speculate about what might happen. And we're starting to now see that, well, there's things happening, and it looks pretty scary. But I guess some of the good news side of it is you're saying that when people go off of it, that you see recovery. That, and this is the amazing thing, I guess, about human beings and our own microbiome, and then hopefully the soil, that we still, it's not too late for us to try to recover our health individually or the health of our land. Do you see it that way?
There's actually scientific evidence to help support the concept of just eliminating the GMOs and the body can rebuild itself. There was a study on mice, and they fed mice genetically modified soybeans, Roundup Ready soybeans, about 14% of the diet, I think, for 8 months. And they had damage to their testicles, pancreas, and liver. Then they took some of them and put them back on a non-GMO soy diet, and there was reversal. Not completely, but it started to reverse. Similarly, they had the control group eating non-GMO soy for 8 months, no problem. And then the last month, they put some of them on a GMO soy diet, and they started to get bad. So there is a reversal that we can see in the animal feeding studies. There's not as much evidence in the soil, although there's some friends of mine, some agronomists and farmers who are working hard to try and figure out how to remediate the soil from glyphosate and other toxins.
So those are two of the areas. What's the third one?
The third is the Roundup and the glyphosate-based herbicides and other herbicides that are sprayed on these herbicide-tolerant crops. You know, it's interesting that there's a lot more research done on Roundup and glyphosate than done on GMOs. And so you can actually connect the dots more easily between the effects, the modes of action of what glyphosate and Roundup do than you can with GMOs or Bt toxin. And if you look at all the more than 30 different diseases that rise in parallel with the increased use of GMOs or Roundup, you could explain a lot of them, perhaps all of them, just by the modes of action that we know about with glyphosate. Glyphosate was originally patented as a cleaner, an industrial cleaner to clean boilers and pipes. And that's because it was patented as a chelator. It grabbed onto the minerals. And so it stripped the minerals from the walls of the pipes and the boilers. And then when it was spilled onto the ground, it killed the wheat, killed all the plants, and so Monsanto bought the molecule and patented it. Now, because it chelates minerals, minerals are absolutely essential for certain metabolic pathways to function. And one of those pathways is called the shikimate pathway, which Monsanto bragged out loud that, well, humans don't have the shikimate pathway, plants do. And we block the shikimate pathway in plants, it kills the plant, therefore it's safe in humans because we don't have a shikimate pathway. But the gut bacteria have a shikimate pathway. The gut bacteria use the shikimate pathway to produce the building blocks, the aromatic amino acids, that produce the neurotransmitters that we all know and love, serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. If we're not producing enough of these neurotransmitters, that could explain a lot of these problems. The depression, the anxiety, the stress from the serotonin, also the regulation of blood sugar, also the ability to say, I'm full, I can stop eating. That's in the domain of serotonin. Melatonin, the sleeplessness. You can track sleep disorders and insomnia with the increased use of glyphosate sprayed on Roundup Ready soy and corn. And the dopamine linked to Parkinson's disease and also other things also linked to these particular diseases and disorders. So that's just one mode of action that Monsanto admits. There's another pathway called the P450 cytochrome pathway, which helps the liver detox. If that becomes damaged or disabled, then all of the other poisons in the environment that are normally detoxed through that pathway become amplified. And that could explain so many problems. It also helps produce vitamin D. There's a vitamin D deficiency that might be correlated also with the increased use of glyphosate. By the way, when I talk about correlation, I have to be absolutely clear. Correlation does not mean causation. Just because two things rise in parallel doesn't mean that one thing causes the other or that they have any relationship. But when you see this causation, when you see the possibilities of how glyphosate does this to the system and how the system then might respond this way, then it adds credence to the possible causation that underlies these two parallel lines going up on the graph. So you have the P450 cytochrome pathway, which also has so many different problems that two scientists describe more than a dozen different disorders, the most prevalent disorders from a Western diet, as possibly being traced to glyphosates interfering with the P450. Now, it wasn't just patented as a chelator. It was also patented as an antibiotic. And as an antibiotic, it more readily kills the beneficial gut bacteria, the lactobacillus, the bifidus, the stuff we pay for in yogurt and then pills and things like that. So it can wipe out, theoretically, the beneficial bacteria, and it doesn't work as effectively against the pathogenic bacteria, the salmonella, the botulism, the nasty E. coli, etc. So they might overgrow in our gut, and that, which is called dysbiosis, is linked to a long list of disorders and can help create leaky gut. So that's just two things, the chelation and the antibiotic. It was also described as a probable human carcinogen, a class 2A carcinogen by the World Health Organization. It also is a mitochondrial toxin. Mitochondria is the energy centers. If we go back to the survey that we did, what is it that gets better when you switch to a non-GMO diet? The number 2 was increased energy. The number 4 was reduced brain fog. Well, there you go. The brain in resting state is 5% weight of the body, but it uses 25% of the energy. Where does it get the energy? The mitochondria. If the mitochondria get damaged, you end up potentially with the brain fog and also the general fatigue. So many people say that when they switch to a non-GMO diet, they have more energy for life. And it could be just this. It also is linked to birth defects. And for 30 years, they've had evidence that it's linked to birth defects. And a report came out blasting both Monsanto and the regulators for hiding that evidence. It's also linked to disruption of the endocrine system. There could be endocrine disrupting chemicals at medium and potentially small concentrations, so that at tiny concentrations, it might have a huge impact. Not just glyphosate, but the other ingredients in Roundup have been shown to have endocrine disrupting effects. It also was shown that tiny amounts of Roundup in the drinking water of rats caused non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which 25% of Americans have, which can lead to much more serious liver problems. Now, you can say, well, it was a rat. How do you know? They probably fed a huge amount to the rat. Well, if you calculate the amount of glyphosate per body weight per day for the rat that caused the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and this was not might cause, this was caused, it was 475,000 times lower than the amount the EPA allows humans to take per body weight per day.
Repeat that number, because it seems
437,000 times lower.
So it sounds like a trace amount. I mean that they had, in relative body weight.
It was in the high parts per trillion.
Yeah. Wow. And still created those adverse outcomes.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the understanding of endocrine disruption chemicals is fascinating and completely counterintuitive. That usually you think the more poison you feed, the greater the effect will be. So you assume that it's a dose response. The increased dose, better response. Mm-hmm. With endocrine disrupting chemicals, you can start off at a very tiny amount and have a huge impact on the hormone system. As you increase the amount, the effect goes down. And then it bottoms out, and then it has a different effect, a toxic effect that goes up as a normal dose response. So it's a U-shaped curve.
It's interesting because you're making a distinction between endocrine disruption and toxicity.
Yes.
And so they're looking for one and not the other.
Well, yeah, and you can also find the toxicity at the low levels at some cases, and they don't know about this in terms of the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I talked to the scientist who did it, and he said, yeah, we don't know if it's an endocrine disruption or a toxicological effect, so I might be overstating things. But yes, generally, the endocrine disruption, the hormonal problems will be triggered oftentimes in this very tiny amount that gets lower if you increase the dose, and then gets higher, then other things can happen and kick in later. And that this side of that U curve is ignored by the Environmental Protection Agency. It is well established in the literature. People all over the world have known about it. You can do things predictably and know that this curve exists. And yet the EPA does not require the low dose testing by the companies for glyphosate and other potentially endocrine disrupting chemicals. And they also know that there was one study that showed that the Roundup mixture is about can be 125 times more toxic than the glyphosate alone, that there's something in Roundup that can be 10,000 times more toxic, that there are other elements that can be endocrine disruptive as well as toxic to human cells, and it forms a soup. But because Monsanto says the only active ingredient is glyphosate, the EPA takes their word for it, ignores the entire formulation, and says, okay, just give us your results on your own testing on glyphosate. So they test glyphosate, technical glyphosate, which isn't even the glyphosate they use in the herbicide. They use technical glyphosate, but glyphosate is used as salts, which is even more toxic than the glyphosate. So they do their own tests, rigged to avoid finding problems, and just test that. Ignore the actual type of glyphosate that they use, ignore the actual soup that it's created in, and then they also ignore the possible interactions with other toxic herbicides that are used at the same time.
Well, you're bringing up something I haven't heard before, because everybody talks about glyphosate, but obviously if it's mixed with other things, they're only looking at the active ingredient, but obviously there's going to be some synergistic effects if it's mixed with these other things that should be tested as it exists, as compared to in a vacuum, in isolation.
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, there's so many research studies that show that Roundup is more toxic than glyphosate. You can show this to the EPA and go, well, yeah, but our regulations are we just look at the active ingredient. The active ingredient is whatever Monsanto says it is, not what the science shows it is. So this is another reason why we must avoid believing the U.S. government on anything related to GMOs or pesticides. They're basically doing the bidding and ignoring science.
Wow. It's really startling because this stuff is it's common sense, right? And these are supposed scientists who should understand these things, but it seems like they're just like literally putting on blinders and saying this is our job, and rather than the spirit of what they're supposed to be doing, it's the following a letter of their edict saying, okay, well, I'm just supposed to look at the active ingredient. We're allowed to accept it from Monsanto, and we're going to put blinders on to what the real situation is, to the peril of the masses.
Absolutely.
So there are several myths, I think, that are out there,
okay.
And you speak extraordinarily eloquent on them.
Thank you.
So let's take one down at a time.
I'll get my gun ready. Myth, pull.
So what do you think is the primary myth, if you can pick one out as the primary?
In the late 90s, the different GMO companies pooled money together, spending $50 million a year for 5 years to convince Americans and other developed country citizens that GMOs were needed to feed the world. And this has become like basically the background story, even though it's entirely untrue. Let's just poke some holes into it and deflate it forever. The most comprehensive evaluation ever conducted on how to feed the world was sponsored by the UN and the World Bank. It was called the ISTAD report. It was written by over 400 scientists who spent years writing this report. And it basically said that GMOs have nothing to offer to feed the hungry world, eradicate poverty, or create sustainable agriculture. I interviewed one of the co-chairmen, I interviewed many of the major writers of it, and they all basically said the same thing. GMOs are not the solution. In fact, one of the co-chairmen said it's basically a solution looking for a problem. It doesn't actually solve anything. It doesn't solve that problem. And the New York Times did an analysis and found out that it didn't increase yield. In fact, many independent scientists doing independent data show that on average it doesn't increase yield. The Union of Concerned Scientists wrote a report, Failure to Yield, where the average GMO does not increase yield. And under the best scenario, it was a 0.3% increase per year because it was killing the corn borer, in certain regions. However, agroecological solutions, organic solutions, can double yield in developing countries.
So, and this is kind of ironic, right? Because they're saying, hey, there's a moral reason to accept GMOs. We're gonna feed starving people around the world,
Right.
And of course, I think there's distribution's a part of that has to be considered, even if there was
Oh
higher
yeah.
yield.
Let me make it clear.
Yeah.
The experts also agree that it's not increased yield that's going to feed the world, because we have more food per person than any time in human history,
Right.
and nearly 1 billion people go to bed malnourished or hungry every night. And so when you give the myth that it's simply a matter of increased yield, you actually exacerbate the problem. Because you said it is distribution, it's economics, it's political will. There's a holistic solution that's necessary, not a silver bullet. And this silver bullet turns out to be a dud anyway.
Mm-hmm. So the reality is, yield, according to many of these scientists, is not increased.
Right.
And the consequence is that people are led to believe that this is something good for the world, and we in the first world countries should embrace it and support it so that we can help people less fortunate.
In other words, you risk being poisoned and sickened by a technology that someday will be developed to increase yield. There is no GMO currently designed to increase yield. Yield actually requires an orchestration of a lot of different genes working together. But we actually are dumb when it comes to the language of the DNA. They get lucky with one single gene put in here that increases BT, that produces BT toxin or allows it to be sprayed with Roundup or glufosinate, another herbicide. So they get lucky, but they don't understand how to create a whole bank of genes working together in a coordinated way to increase yield. And what does increase yield is more agroecological solutions and also traditional breeding. And this raises another point.
Right.
Part of the PR rhetoric is that GMOs are just an extension of natural breeding we've been doing for centuries.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I have people saying, this isn't new. This has been going on for a long time. We've always been genetically modifying foods.
Yeah, this was an intentional confusion of the word genetic modification, because Europe picked up the word genetic modification as genetic engineering of transferring genes between species. And so the PR companies, the biotech industry, said, why don't we just take the word genetic modification and change its definition? What we can do is we simply expand the definition of genetic modification to include all these techniques, and because they all name the same thing, we can call them the same thing. So I remember reading George Wald, a Nobel laureate, say we should not confuse the process of genetic engineering with traditional breeding, because with genetic engineering you're creating new organisms overnight that were not part of the billions of years of evolution. When you look at the scientists of the FDA, they say there was a compliance officer who summarized the statements of the scientists and said, it is the opinion of the technical experts of the agency that the process of genetic engineering is different than traditional breeding and leads to different risks. I was sitting with Belinda Martineau, who worked on the first approved genetically modified crop, the Flavor Saver tomato, no longer on the market. And we were on stage here in California, and there was hundreds of people in the audience. I said, Belinda, is genetic engineering just an extension of natural breeding? And she rolled her eyes and says, no, it's not an extension of natural breeding. From a scientific standpoint, it is completely different. From a public relations standpoint, they try and cram it together and saying we've been genetically modifying for centuries. If you look at the original corn, it was this, it wasn't edible. If you look at the original chicken, if you're against genetic modification, you're against progress, you're against the food that you're eating. It's all ridiculous. That's not what we're talking about, and they know it. It's not like we were confused. We thought you were talking about all forms of crossbreeding and selective breeding. No. We're talking about the process of taking a gene, let's say from soil bacteria, making millions of copies, putting it into a gene gun, shooting that gun into a plate of millions of cells, cloning those cells into crops so that every single cell of those crops has that gene-sized spray bottle, and that it creates hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA. Up to 5% of the genes that are functioning in that crop can change their levels of expression. That's not natural. That was never done before. So those people that say, well, we've been genetically modifying for years, first of all, there's the liars and the lied to. So if you've been talking to people who believe that, they're not necessarily the liars. They're not necessarily trying to convince you that it's something that they know is not true. They've just drank the Kool-Aid. They just believe what they've been told over and over and over again. And because of this trick of the terms, oh yeah, we genetically modified beer, we genetically modified corn from hundreds of years ago, it's the same term. So let's just call it genetic engineering. Different term, whatever. It's very, very different risks. You can look at this, at the memos at the website of the Institute for Responsible Technology of the scientists working at the FDA, where they say the process is different, leads to different risks.
Dan, thanks so much for taking some time to speak with us today.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little bio sketch, a little bit of your background?
Chiropractor by trade, but co-founder of Health Centers of the Future, where really the goal is to train doctors in what I learned in my own illness, and that's the cellular healing and cellular detox. And that is my passion, from pain to purpose. So it really applies with today's subject.
And what does this have to do with GMOs?
Yeah, because GMOs obviously carry a lot of toxins, especially one called glyphosate, which we're going to talk a lot about today because it is the 800-pound gorilla in the room of why people are getting sick.
So before we get into that, I heard you mention something just before about your own, I think you said your own pain or your own suffering.
From pain to purpose.
Pain to purpose, there you go.
Yeah.
So what's your story? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, life as I knew it was really good. I had a very successful practice, helping a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I would say that I was in the best shape of my life, fitness-wise, training for these bike races, and all of a sudden fatigue hit. Thought I was overtraining, like most athletes would, and took time off the bike and wasn't getting better. Would go back to training and massive fatigue, and then it went into insomnia, panic attacks, all types of hormone disruption, became intolerant to just about everything I was eating. So life as I know it really changed, and I got so bad it became very difficult even to practice. Thank God I had a partner at the time that was making up that for me, because I really couldn't function. I wasn't sleeping at all, and the anxiety was debilitating. And for me, even to go through the bizarre symptoms I had, most people would be like, really? And all that happened? It did, and I didn't know why.
Did you start going out for exams and diagnoses and so on? And
I did. I think, like most people, my philosophy was such: remove the interference, the body does the healing. And I grew up from an Italian bricklayer who raised me with a chiropractic philosophy, believe it or not. I didn't grow up on medications, antibiotics, and those things. So, I really just instinctively was looking upstream. Now, my wife will tell you, there was times that, maybe I should have taken a psychotropic drug, but she was really the one that reminded me that, look, there's an answer for this. You were normal, now look what's going on. There's something. And I kept digging upstream. When I had the mental capacity to do so, and I really, from my childhood, I had dyslexia actually, but because of my dyslexia, I had an ability to remember studies and read studies, and at times I still had that, but I had massive brain fog as part of this illness, but when I did have my brain, I was just finding answers, and everything that I teach today, honestly, really came out of that.
Did anybody who was assessing you try to assert that this is all in your head, some phantom disease, so what did they say to you?
Well, I didn't close that circle completely, because when I was, I did have the philosophy to go upstream, but I was looking, right? I was going to get tests, and unfortunately at that time, I found nothing. I mean, every test seemed like it would come back normal. I knew my adrenals were shot, my thyroid was shot, but yet, my adrenals showed exhaustion on some saliva cortisol tests, but that happens to many people. My thyroid, which absolutely was malfunctioning, my body temperature was low, my hair was thinning and falling out, but yet my blood work was normal. So that's when you get the it's all in your head type thing.
And this is kind of the interesting thing, because when you're affected by toxins that unwittingly are entering your body,
right?
A lot of times traditional medical testing doesn't really observe any of that dynamic. And it's a very, unfortunately, black and white system of saying, hey, we're looking at lab results, we got numbers, the numbers look fine. This must all be in your head, because there's no other explanation.
Yeah. Happens all the time. I remember, my bill was like $4,000 or $5,000 for like a set of blood work.
Right.
Every marker. Some things a little off, but basically you're healthy, so it's all in your head. And then I went outside of that, of course, and started running all types of other tests, from gut tests to this test, and really nothing really was showing that this is what's wrong. I'm telling you, I wanted to find if you came back with a diagnosis of cancer, I would have been okay, because at least I know what I'm up against.
Right.
I either win or die. You know, I mean, I either make it or not. It's like I was okay with either. My biggest fear was living life like I was living it. I'm telling you, it was the debilitating anxiety, the depression, the mood changes, the hormone disruption that I was going through. I would rather have been dead.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement. And for the full context, you're married, you've got kids, you're responsible for a large practice that serves a lot of people. This is where it gets humanized, because it's not a straight A to B thing, is it? Where it's just health problem, test, health solution.
Right.
There's a complex life surrounding it that brings humanity to the dynamic of it all. And that's where, what I heard you say is, listen, I don't care if it's like a really bad diagnosis like cancer or something, either I win or I die, just so I kind of can get some firm orientation as to what I need to be doing. But to be lost in a fog, that's a problem. And I think that goes to the core of this issue in many respects relative to GMOs.
Absolutely. Look, when you look at what I experienced, look, my parents, your parents, started getting sick in their 60s, chronic diseases, right? And they were the typicals, right? Heart disease, diabetes, even cancer. But today, our generation is starting to get sick in their 30s with unexplainable illnesses, meaning that we don't know really what's going on, right? So what I experienced has become more common. Today, it's happening in teenagers. You see teenagers that are allergic to these foods. We didn't see this growing up. We see teenagers who have anxiety, right? I mean, suicide, autism, I mean, you name it. These conditions are becoming so prevalent, and there's a reason. And part of the reason is the subject today.
So how did you finally figure out what was going on?
Yeah, so, it's ironic how things happen, right? Because I was actually online looking, and I found something called Mad Hatter's disease. And when you know what that is, people making felt hats were using mercury, and they became acutely mercury poisoned, and they became known as mad as a hatter. Well, when I looked at the symptoms, I'm like, I'm mad as a hatter. I mean, I literally had every symptom of this. And so I said, this is me. I went down to the head of toxicology at the head hospital at Pittsburgh, where I was living at the time. He ran, again, all of these tests. Mercury was one of them. It was a blood test. Showed negative. Showed some mercury, but it was in normal ranges. So I was devastated, because I thought surely this was it. It was probably a year or so later that I became good friends with a very bright endocrinologist, read all his books. And he said, Dan, I think you have mercury toxicity. I said, oh man, I thought so too. But I did a blood test a year ago, and it showed negative. He said, that's the wrong test. That will show if you had acute mercury poisoning, but I think you have chronic. So he said, do this test, and I did. I challenged the mercury out of my tissue where it bioaccumulated, and there it showed. So the next question was, where do you think I got it? He said, did you have any dental work done around the time this all happened? And so I was logging my cycling miles, and I looked of when my symptoms started, called my good friend who was my dentist, who took 2 silver amalgam fillings out, which contained 50% mercury. And lo and behold, days after that is when the symptoms started.
Wow.
And it just progressed from there. Now look, I mean, looking back, I wore contact lenses in the 80s, early 90s. It had thimerosal in it, which is a mercury derivative that has ethyl mercury, which crosses right into the brain. And my father slathered me in methylate mercurochrome. So I had other exposures. And looking back, I had some signs. But when I got the amalgams out, it sent my bucket overflowing.
Tipping point,
the symptoms. Yeah, it was a tipping point.
So now this is where it gets interesting, because we might say, how does this relate to the subject we're talking about today?
Yes.
And this is where it's a much more, I don't want to say complex, but it's a much more multifaceted as far as the whole range of implications of GMOs, from genetically modifying organisms in and of themselves to the sprays that are put on them, to what those toxins might do in your body directly, and what other things they might facilitate on a biological basis. So let's start putting this together, because your expertise, where you've been studying, is on the clinical side.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the clinical side of GMOs.
Yeah, look, when we look at the statistics, like, by 2032, 1 in 2 kids on the autism spectrum, it's almost hard to believe. You look at 1 in 3 people over the age of 65 by 2050 with Alzheimer's. I mean, these statistics are staggering. It's hard for even myself oftentimes to grasp those numbers. However, when you understand what we're seeing today, this is what I've been teaching on to doctors. There's 3 toxins that are affecting 4 generations. Glyphosate, which is being sprayed on GMOs. You have to understand what GMOs are. And I think a lot of your educators are going to talk about this. But these things are genetically modified to be able to take a spray that the same company, Monsanto, who develops the GMOs, develops the chemical. So they're developing plants that we're able to put 10 times the amount of this chemical on, even more, and not hurt the plant, but affect the weeds around it. So we're getting exposed to levels of this chemical that more and more studies are showing causes cancer, tumors, and a lot of disruption in what we call the microbiome, which is now leading to conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, obesity. So a study that Stephanie Seneff, she's the senior scientist at MIT, and I believe you're interviewing.
Yes.
So one of her studies, I think it was in 2012, was one of the first studies to show that this glyphosate chemical actually allows these other chemicals that were being affected generationally, like mercury, like myself, so we're bringing it full circle, lead, which were the #1 source of lead is our parents.
Right.
And we can talk about those things because we're all exposed. However, the 3rd chemical affecting 4 generations is glyphosate, because her study showed it allows glyphosate to basically penetrate into deeper tissue like the brain. So we're seeing this 3 chemicals come together. The exposure of mercury, the exposure like no time before because of vaccines, which vaccines revealed showed, right? Yeah. Vaccines and other sources, our parents, the lead that we get from our parents, and now glyphosate, which is allowing it to cross into the brain. This sets up those statistics.
So you're saying that glyphosate actually acts as a sort of a door opener or a facilitator for these toxins to cross the blood-brain barrier?
Yes, absolutely. And therein lies part of the problem. So we're already a poisoned generation because of what we inherit from our parents of mercury, lead, and then we add this component to the new generation. That's why we're seeing the numbers that we're seeing. So you put this together. It's what I call a perfect storm. And if you remember what the perfect storm is, right? It's the 3 weather fronts. Who was it? Clooney, right? The perfect storm. The 3 weather fronts come together, and that's the catastrophic storm that happens once in 100 years. Well, this storm is happening every day in America because we have these 3 chemicals coming together and crossing into the brain, which is now explaining why we're seeing so much illness.
And classical medicine, if you will, is not really set up to assess all this. So there's a lot of people out there who are sick in this sort of vague way. They're undiagnosed. They're grasping at straws and looking for solutions. And you've been spending quite a bit of energy and quite a bit of years trying to find them or reach out. What's that like? What's it like knowing that there's these people out there and you're trying to throw a lifeline to them so they can get some context for what they're struggling with?
With the social media presence that I've been blessed to have, they're reaching out to me in such great numbers that there's almost a sadness in me because I can't get to them all. My passion now has been training doctors, which I've been blessed to train, a few hundred doctors around the country in the process of what I call true cellular detox as an answer, to this epidemic. And that's the thing. I mean, when you understand, and I still talk to probably at least 20 people a week and hear their stories of unexplainable illnesses. And the story's the same. They've done everything. They've changed their diet. They eat better than anyone they know. And yet, they still have these symptoms. They've been to countless doctors, the handful, and they go through the list, and yet they still don't feel well. Well, the reason is because very few, even alternative doctors, are going upstream high enough to really affect this epidemic. And when you look at really what we've inherited, the mercury from vaccinations, amalgam fillings. We grew up in the mercury generation. Look, the Duresh study is a study that they showed the number of fillings in mom's mouth is proportional to how much mercury we find in babies' brains on autopsy. So that's pretty convincing. Lead, the number one source is mom. During pregnancy, women lose bone. Out comes the lead in utero. So exposure, and then we add glyphosate, which is the new generational problem, which we know now, Senef studies, showing that this is allowing these chemicals that we're all exposed to cross deeper into the brain. That is ultimately why we're seeing this massive rise in these unexplainable illnesses. And again, the symptoms and the stories are the same.
So when somebody is faced with this toxic accumulation, which is creating these health challenges, and they might say, okay, well, I'm going to switch to organic, I'm going to switch to non-GMO foods, et cetera, and they're not seeing like they're getting better, it's not because it wasn't the basis for it, it's because they already have an accumulation of toxins that are not exiting the body. They have no way to exit the body.
Absolutely. So the glyphosate in and itself creates some problems that we need to talk about. But you're right. It's now caused these other chemicals that we've all been exposed to in utero and throughout our life, right? When you look at the amount of aluminum, in her study, Senef studies showed how the glyphosate allows the aluminum to cross into the brain. It's in vaccines. I mean, you look at one hepatitis B vaccine, 250 micrograms. You know what's acceptable on an IV for an 8 to 10 pound infant is no more than 30 micrograms. Why? Because they know it leads to neurological problems. And yet 250 micrograms on the day of birth is injected into a child. How does that math work out, right? So, and then we expose our children to glyphosate out of the womb. I mean, it's in mother's milk, they're finding it, right? And then if they're, God forbid, they're giving them soy-based products, which is loaded with this chemical because soy is all GMO. Right. Now we're allowing this stuff, basically pushing it into the brain. Now we look at a statistic, 1 out of 2 by 2032 on the autism spectrum, and we go, I get it. Yeah. I get it.
Yeah, so is there hope? From the clinical perspective, people who are facing these challenges, and maybe people are, let's call them preclinical, meaning they're not really experiencing robust symptoms and signs, but there's this stuff accumulating, and keep eating the foods that are sprayed with glyphosate, that are the GMO foods, and it's going to hit a tipping point for them someday.
Exactly.
So if you're somebody that's health conscious and you either have a challenge or you want to prevent a future challenge, symptomatically speaking, what do you do?
Well, I mean, I think removing the sources. Look, I teach something, my 5 R's of how to fix a cell. It's become a roadmap for doctors, but even the public now. And R number 1 is removing the source. If you don't remove this stuff from your diet, I mean, eating 100% organic is the simple solution, right? I mean, could you still get some exposure? The answer is yes, but massively minimizing your exposure to glyphosate. Even conventional grains, whether it's rice, oatmeal, they're spraying this chemical on these foods. It's called desiccation. It shrivels it. Bottom line, they do it because they increase their harvest and profits. That's why they're doing it. Right. But we're getting even levels there. So going to all organic is step 1. Getting this stuff out of your system through what I call cellular detox is step 2. Look, when we look at the other problems with glyphosate, you start to understand, you said the word, you'll eventually hit a tipping point, right? I think that what we're seeing now with the average healthy person is just a lack of energy, brain fog, maybe some sleep issues, not recovering the same, right? And we almost think of that as normal. Hormone disruption, it's not normal at all. When you understand what's going on and you compare us to more primitive countries, you go, this is not normal. Glyphosate is driving a lot of this. Okay, so we talked about Stephanie Senef. Some of her other studies, and I remember a study back in 2013 that back then I was talking about, is what GMOs sprayed with glyphosate is causing. She talked about how it shuts down a pathway called the cytochrome P450 pathway. You don't have to remember that, except that that's a detox pathway, very important. When glyphosate shuts that down, now we're accumulating all these other toxins. And then glyphosate opens up the blood-brain barrier. Problem. In that same study, she showed that glyphosate disrupts certain bacteria that we need to make certain amino acids, that we need to make certain really important chemicals for our brain. Okay, let me give you an example. There's an amino acid that certain bacteria make called tryptophan. Tryptophan we need to make melatonin, which controls sleep cycle. We wonder why we have an epidemic of people who can't sleep. Glyphosate's playing a role there. Oh, and by the way, that's also in that study linking this chemical to autism and Alzheimer's. When you look at these correlation studies, and if you go online, you can Google Nancy Swanson glyphosate correlation studies, you'll see disease after disease like Alzheimer's, autism, obesity. As glyphosate was introduced into the food chain, you see these diseases rise dramatically. So glyphosate destroys a chemical that we need to make certain amino acids. It's called a shikimate pathway, and for our brain to function normal. So literally, disrupting the bacteria disrupts how your brain works. Here's one more example. There's an amino acid called tyrosine, which we need to make serotonin, which we need to make dopamine, right? So dopamine is part of Parkinson's. So again, glyphosate up, Parkinson's up. So all of this is leading to these early symptoms: brain fog, short-term memory loss, energy loss. But the point is glyphosate is playing a role multi-ways. It's affecting our microbiome. It's affecting chemicals going deeper into our brain. This is the epidemic.
I hear you sometimes use the term leaky gut.
Yeah.
So what is leaky gut, and how does glyphosate or GMOs play a role in that?
Yeah. So when we look at leaky gut, multiple ways glyphosate affects it, right? And by the way, GMOs in general, there's a study that I'm sure one of your presenters will talk about that GMOs literally shares its DNA with your gut bacteria. Okay, so follow me. They have something called BT corn, right? This corn was genetically modified to basically develop its own chemical to fight off pests, right? So pretty brilliant, because that would, sure enough, we would use less pesticides and herbicides, right? This sounds really good on the surface. However, what this study showed is that this GMO is sharing its altered DNA with our gut bacteria. So our gut bacteria becomes pesticide producers. That's what it was designed to do. So now we're literally making in our microbiome, in our gut bacteria, a chemical which drives leaky gut. Doesn't sound very good. So that's one way. I mean, it's hard to believe, we're becoming pesticide factories.
It doesn't sound desirable at all.
Yeah.
But what is leaky gut? Can you define
okay.
what that
So
is?
leaky gut is basically, look, partly it's an inflamed gut that allows bad things to cross where it shouldn't. So if you imagine your intestine, you imagine like a pipe that has holes in it. That's a very simplified version. And things are getting across into your bloodstream that needed digested more. And now they're leaking across, and now you form antibodies against it, and it drives inflammation. It makes you feel really crappy. Simple as that, right? But it causes other food allergies, food intolerances, bad. But also, leaky gut is, you have something in your gut called tight junctions. They're meant to open and close. They allow antibodies in when needed. They allow nutrients in and out. It's meant to be, but it's meant to open and close. Glyphosate can cause the permanent opening, premature opening of these tight junctions. And when that happens, now we have basically a highway of these undigested proteins flowing into our bloodstream, driving inflammation and antibody reactions. So that's not good. So glyphosate affects our bacteria, which affects our immune system, affects our brain work, as I explained, affects our detox pathways. It affects all these things, including opening up our tight junctions, which affects our immune system differently, driving autoimmune, which is a whole other subject.
Now, you are suggesting vertical genetic effects, meaning passed from mother to child?
Absolutely.
So what are the mechanisms there? How does that work?
Well, remember I said these 3 chemicals are affecting 4 generations? One way is physical inheritance. So I talked about inheriting lead from mom, right? I inherited mercury and lead from mom. It's estimated 4 generations of just physical inheritance of those
And I was going to
chemicals.
say, you're not talking about genetic inheritance,
Right.
it's a physical inheritance.
Meaning that if we got rid of every bit of lead now, it would still be 4 generations to literally just breed out the lead.
Wow.
Because every pregnancy, mom loses bone and out comes the lead, 4 generations. But to your other point, the second way it's affecting 4 generations is epigenetically, meaning that these toxins that we're talking about turn on certain genes that can be turned on for 4 generations. So that is another way that glyphosate, lead, mercury, all working together, are turning on genes. So for example, there was a study done out of Duke University. They took identical twin mice, okay?
They're genetically identical.
Genetically identical, same DNA. They fed them the same, exercised them the same, they just split them, the brothers and sisters, up into 2 groups. This group, they exposed to a chemical that most of us are exposed to, BPA. And it triggered a gene. And this gene's called the agouti gene, and it gave certain symptoms. They became obese, their hair turned yellow and dry, sounds like a thyroid condition, but they turned on that gene. This group, they didn't give the chemical and they stayed the same. What they showed in the study was, that gene was turned on in the next generation, and the next generation. So the next generation became doomed for obesity as little teenage mice without doing anything. Their diet didn't change. They were eating the same diet. That sounds familiar today. We have teenagers with genes turned on.
So doesn't this become a part of the outrage, right? Because obesity for many people is a moral judgment, right?
That's right.
Oh, you lack discipline, you lack proper behaviors, you don't have respect for your own body, you allow yourself to get fat, right? But if what you're saying is true, and you're saying you got genetically identical mice, based on, I think you said the research came out of Duke,
right,
that literally there's an epigenetic phenomenon, meaning that there's environmental cues that are causing genes to switch on that otherwise would not be on.
Absolutely.
That translate into this obesity. So now you've got, morally speaking, from a set of actions, 2 mammals who are eating the same diet, but one becomes obese, sickly, and the other one doesn't, just because of the influence of these exogenous toxins. And this is the really chilling thing to me, that it's vertically transmitted, meaning through generations.
That's right.
You're seeing that the switch stays flipped on, and there's the predisposition happens. So when you start to look at, and this is where I get, I have to control because I get irate, I get incensed. But this is where people who are looking at corporate profits.
That's right.
And I'm not anti-business, but when there's a malicious agenda with known consequences that not only talk about innocence, it's one thing to say that a parent is unwitting in their knowledge, but then how much more innocent can you get to the offspring who weren't even in the world when these boardroom decisions are made and not corrected when it's known that there's transgression here. So the whole thing becomes an untenable thing to process emotionally or spiritually, right? I mean, these are human beings, and this is our progeny. This is what's going down the line. So I guess maybe in part is I'm making a statement more than a question here, but it leads to a question for me. Is I happen to know your passion. So what are you thinking about every day? Because you're getting up every day to go to work to do something about this. So give me your personal experience. What does it feel like to go to work on this every day?
Well, being this person who had an unexplainable illness, I mean, that gave me my purpose, right? I believe in my heart that there is a promise, for those crying out for answers. I really do. Otherwise, that's what drives me day in, day out, because I talk to the people who have no answers. And alternative medicine as it is failing them, and sure enough, allopathic medicine has already failed them, because really, who's going upstream? That's why my vision is to really train a larger and larger group of doctors who are going up to the answer. You and I have had dinner conversations where, hitting on that spiritual side of things, or hitting on that, we start asking ourselves, how could someone do this? And I know some of people watching this are going to go into a conspiracy route saying there's an agenda. The government has an agenda. Someone has an agenda. They don't, and that's one side of it. Personally, I don't believe that. Personally, I've met people that work for Monsanto that really believe in their heart that they're trying to solve world hunger and they have an answer. And I think that as new studies come out, I think some people mentally fall apart and perhaps leave the company. I think that other people just can't deal with that and they go on justifying. We're human. I think it's a human thing. I mean, you're a great study of philosophy. I mean, I think that it's going to be very interesting when I sit back and watch this series of speakers, because I think we're going to get a lot of opinions there. And I'm not forcing mine on anybody, but I know this, regardless of how it's happened, why it's happened, the human intent behind it, we have a problem that we have to deal with. We see the numbers escalating, on all these unexplainable illnesses, diseases. And I'm telling you, this is the first generation to not outlive their parents, but it's worse than that. This is the first generation that has chronic diseases as teenagers and children, that we've never seen before. I'm telling you, wait till this generation of teenagers hits their 30s. Patrick, what's that going to do? We're trying to solve a healthcare crisis. What's it going to do? I mean, how's it going to withstand it? I mean, so when you ask me the question about what motivates me or how I feel about, being part of this solution, I mean, that's what I think about. When I'm saying, man, we have an answer, to getting this stuff out of us. I have part of the answer. I sure don't have all of it, but I do have part of it, right? Where, but that's what drives me, because I see something going to happen. Man, there's a storm on the horizon, that it makes me shake inside, I can't describe it any other way.
For good reason.
Yeah.
So when it comes to now detoxing and the solutions that you've studied, I hear some people say, "Oh, I'm detoxing my liver." Some people say, "I detox my brain." What are the systems, if you will, that need to be detoxed? Like,
That's a great question.
So where is there one? Is there multiple ones? Is there a sequence to them? How does that all work?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I think that if someone would just take what we already said from here, they would say, yeah, I detox, I do a cleanse every year. And I think that, again, I can be as critical as alternative medicine as I am over here, right? Yeah. Because I think we get that impression that we can do the 10-day cleanse that we can buy in a health food store, and we're good. Or the 5-day liver cleanse, or the master cleanse, whatever it is, right? The colon cleanse. And there's really nothing wrong with those things. However, if you've been paying attention, to this talk here, it's the problems at the cell. This is what's happening. When we look at Senef's work and others, the problem is what's happening at the cellular level. So in short, real detox has to happen at the cell. So I have a saying, I'm known for it now. You won't get well until you fix the cell, and more specifically, you won't get well until you detox the cell. That's the epidemic. As we talk about the perfect storm, mercury, lead, glyphosate crossing into the brain cells, this is the issue.
So literally, this is not so much that it's just targeted. What's going on is that it affects all cells.
It does.
And there's ways maybe to get cells to detox. I know that you've worked on formulations for that. And it requires, I would imagine, some level of vigilance around it.
No, that's why my passion is training doctors around the country to do this, what we call true cellular detox. Because, look, when you talk to scientists, they seem to get it, right? If we can get the cells doing what they do, that's real detox. As one example, I said my 5 R's is a roadmap, right? R number 1 is we have to remove the sources. R number 2 is regenerating the cell membrane. The cell membrane is critical for allowing the good stuff in the cell, but the bad stuff out. Then there's the mitochondrial membrane, which is, in every cell we have these mitochondria where we make energy. That membrane is critical just to make energy so your brain works, so you can think clear, so you can digest, and your detox pathways need every bit of that ATP that's made there. So regenerating the membrane, you can't detox without doing that. And R3 is restoring cellular energy, which, again, I just recently had a conversation with a group of brilliant scientists who said, detox, the key is cellular energy, restoring ATP. I'm like, they get it. Doctors don't get it. So again, colon cleanse is fine. It opens up a pathway. But unless we get the cell doing what it's meant to do, that's the key. That's how lives come back.
Well, give us the last 2 R's. Don't hold us in suspense.
Yeah, exactly. I knew you were going to say that. Well, I mean, R number 4, I think, is the more obvious. It's, reducing cellular inflammation, which a lot of the things that we teach, with, dietary, as well as, other, products that we use to downregulate cellular inflammation. Very important. If you don't reduce the inflammation, the cell's not going to detox or work. R number 5 is reestablishing methylation. And methylation, it's kind of an epidemic within the epidemic. Methylation is, we've been talking about epigenetics. Your body has these little things called methyl donors that literally it used as cell signals to turn genes on and off. So as an example, if you get stressed, it'll take a methyl donor, it will turn on cortisol pathways, adrenaline pathways. You adapt to the stress. But then it takes these same methyl groups and it turns off that process, and you downregulate and feel normal. So you need methyl groups to do all these activities. You need methyl groups to detox. Here's another one. You need methyl groups to actually get rid of toxic hormones. Here's the other problem. Stress can deplete these, physical, chemical, or emotional. So as the depletion happens because of chemical stressors and emotional stressors, now you don't have enough of these to turn off bad genes. So now you start turning on bad genes, right? And that's not good. Now you don't have enough of these to get rid of toxic hormones. So now we know that there's, breast cancer and other cancers. Part of it is the lack of methylation to get rid of toxic estrogen. So the point is reestablishing methylation is a major issue because we're all under so much stress. The planet's walking around methyl depleted. So again, you're not going to fix detox of your cell without reestablishing methylation.
Which means that you can't adapt.
Exactly.
You've lost adaptive ability.
Absolutely. And now you're not adapting to emotional, chemical, or any stress, even exercise at that point.
So this is all compelling and chilling all at the same time. So now give me your vision for the world as you'd like to see it, and maybe give me some ideas on how we can get there.
Well, I mean, I think if you talk to any politician, they would say that, health care is the most important thing. It's the top of the agenda. A country, if you look at the collapse of Rome or any ancient culture, it started with health. So as we see the world as a solution to world prosperity, the solution to poverty, the solution to so many things, it starts here. Right now, we have an epidemic of this glyphosate issue. It is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I think that this piece is so important because right now it's being talked about, but most people don't see it for what it really is. It is changing the planet that we live on dramatically. I mean, just throwing out some of those studies and how it disrupts these pathways and the chemicals we need for our brain to work and the immune system and leaky gut, which leads to autoimmune. I mean, we can review all of those studies, but what people have to understand is it's affecting our globe, the economics of the globe. So if you want to affect the planet, this is a massive issue right here. And yes, it goes in part with the vaccine issue that we covered, right? It goes in part with the food you're eating. I mean, all of it. But glyphosate is it's like a magnifying glass on making the planet worse. We want to change the planet, we have to deal with this 800-pound gorilla.
Well, let me just close by saying I respect, admire, and appreciate the work you're doing and the purpose behind it and the spirit it brings into the world. And because people like you are out there, there's hope for our future and maybe more importantly, the future of our children and grandchildren. So however tiresome things might get, don't ever stop.
I appreciate that because, when you're above here, preaching a message that the world needs, the pressure comes, no doubt. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed that episode, and the momentum continues to build Tomorrow, we have part 2 of Jeffrey Smith's interview, and he really takes on a lot of the myths surrounding GMOs, so you want to hear that. We also have this amazing interview with David Wolf. David is an enigmatic character. We went to Hawaii to his ranch to film this episode, and I will tell you that it is uplifting, inspiring, informative, and fun. You want to catch that particular interview for sure. And lastly, tomorrow, we have an interview with billionaire Naveen Jain. You might say, why does he want to speak to this issue? Watch the interview and you'll find out. He has an understanding about the microbiome of the human body and the future of humanity that plays totally into this GMO issue, and he has some really interesting things to say about that. So remember, share this. Let people know about GMOs Revealed. They need to understand this information. Continue to watch day by day, and I look forward to being with you tomorrow.